Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio. And now, here's our host, Dr. Vanessa Anceloni.
Welcome, dear listener, to Kardec Radio. Today is a very special day because we're celebrating the 4th of July in the United States, the day in which our planet Earth learned about the importance of the law of freedom. And from the United States, the whole world started being inspired by the beautiful legacy of the American nation. And not only that, but we're also celebrating the 2nd anniversary of Kardec Radio. Can you believe it? 2 years went by. And Kardec Radio now has reached an international level. It is already in 61 countries. And not only that, we have already reached more than 60,000 listeners per show in special shows. And we are also on demand. So we never know where it's going to end up because it's open to everyone 24/7. And today we're more honored than any other day because the leading authority in the research on spirituality, healing, mediumship in the world, Dr. Gary Schwartz, a good friend of our Spiritist movement, of ours, a great collaborator, he is here with us. Back again, he was on the first show at Kardec Radio on July 4th, 2011 at 12 p.m. And he's back again. And we are rejoiced by the possibility of talking to him, getting to know more about his advancements, his observations. And we also have on the second hour the presence of Dr. Raymond Moody Jr., the renowned scholar and researcher on near-death experience, together with Dr. Eben Alexander, who has been the best-selling author of the book Proof of Heaven. He himself, as a neurosurgeon, had a near-death experience. And now, together, Dr. Moody Jr. with Eben Alexander are releasing a video series entitled Conversations with Raymond Moody on the very topic about life beyond life. And we have a lot to talk. We have a lot to talk about, and we have here with us Kardec Radio's team. Directly from the studios at Kardec Radio, we have our friend Kirsten De Mello, who is here with us. Hi, Kirsten. Thank you for being with us.
Sure, it's always a pleasure.
And Kirsten and Daniel Santos is also here, as much as Carlos Diaz. We have also John De Rosa and many other friends at Kardec Radio. So you who is listening to us, whomever you are, wherever you are in the world, remember, you can ask your questions to Dr. Gary Schwartz, to Dr. Moody Jr., to Dr. Alexander, to Kardec Radio's team. Make a suggestion, either by calling us directly at our toll-free number, 1-858-769-4705, or you can also email to us at kardec@kardecradio.com and send your comment, your question, or directly at the chat room of Kardec Radio when you log in to listen to the program. The beauty of it all is that whomever calls, whomever chats with us, is going to receive a gift, Kardec Radio's t-shirt, the latest issue of the Spiritist magazine, which is fascinating, and also the latest release by the Odyssey publisher, which is Spiritism in its Simplest Expression by Allan Kardec. And thus, you will participate with us. Be with us in this 3-hour marathon celebrating Kardec Radio's anniversary, and most especially the beauty of the law of freedom coming true in the United States and inspiring the world since 1776. Right now we are going to kickstart with a message that talks about the doorway to life. This message came through Divaldo Franco, through his mediumship. The experimenter Joana de Angelis wrote the following message, and now came true in voice recording. And you can get a hold of this and many other messages from the CD Living and Loving by accessing the website of the Spirit Society of Baltimore at www.ssbaltimore.org. And you know, as we kickstart the program, rejoice in your heart because there is beautiful message that is coming throughout the whole 3-hour show for us today.
The Doorway to Life.
Throughout centuries, death has been so related with taboos, grotesque beliefs, mystery, and superstition that people were led to fear it and to consider it as the inevitable end of life. Even the religious views of death were mistaken. According to their tenets, the dead were severely judged and had to face eternal damnation if condemned, or eternal salvation if absolved. People then learned to consider death, which is a natural biological event, as a supernatural, much-feared moment, when conversely it is a doorway to real life. Science has demonstrated that nothing ends. On the contrary, everything in nature undergoes a process of transformation. Why then would we end after physical death when everything else changes from one form to another? In all civilizations, mediumship has demonstrated that life continues after death. The spiritualist doctrine made clear the divine laws that govern all life. With spiritualist teachings, survival after death becomes an important assertion. It also discloses the spirit world, demonstrates that spirit preexists the physical body, and also that the spirit world is the dimension where spirit comes from before birth and returns to when life in the physical body ends. With death so unmasked, immortality could be understood and accepted. We reap what we sow. Our happiness or misfortune is a consequence of our very acts. However, no matter what our life conditions are on account of our actions, the presence of love in our lives is the most comforting demonstration of divine fatherhood. It helps us to atone for our errors and proceed with our spiritual ascent. Death is a natural phenomenon. Think about death as you carefully plan your physical life, and program your physical life considering the changes that death will bring into your life. To die is to change one's vibratory condition, but death in itself will not change your emotional reality. If a dear one has preceded you in the journey of death into real life, thank God for his or her liberation. The physical body is like a prison, but it provides us with the opportunity to learn and accelerate our evolution. Death is freedom. However, you must make your life so useful that your death may lead you into radiant joy. Think with serenity and joy in your heart of your loved ones who have departed from the physical body. Do not torment yourself imagining all the things you could have done for them, or of all the words you could have said to them. Love them tenderly. Think of them knowing that they hear you, they see you, and partake of your joys and your concerns. If you really love them, do not send them depressing mental messages. On the contrary, let them know that you are happy, so that they who also love you may rest in peace and wait patiently for the time when you will join them when your time comes. Together you will continue your evolution, resuming the bonds of love that death has temporarily interrupted but not severed. Pray for them, cherish them in your memory, and honor them doing whatever good you can. Whoever saw Jesus nailed to a humiliating cross and suffering the agonies of death would never imagine that later, crowned by divine light, he would rise from the dead and confirm to mankind the great reality of immortality. We must remember, however, that before the morning of resurrection, he had to face the evening of Calvary. Death is the doorway to life, a door through which we all must pass on our way to eternal happiness.
Dear listener, the 4th of July is here and we're celebrating the 2nd anniversary of Kardec Radio. And we have here with us the very, very friend and leading authority in the studies of spirituality, mediumship, healing in the world. Dr. Gary Schwartz, who is a professor of psychology, medicine, neurology, psychiatry, and surgery at the University of Arizona and director of its Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health. He's also corporate director of development of energy healing for Canyon Range Resorts and the author of several books, including The Afterlife Experiments, The God Experiments, The Truth and Medium, The Energy Healing Experiments, and co-author of The Living Energy Universe. He has authored or co-authored more than 450 scientific papers, including 6 in the journal Science, and has co-edited 11 academic books. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Society, the American Psychological Society, the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research, the Society of Behavioral Medicine, and he has appeared on hundreds of television radio programs, including HBO, Discovery, Arts and Entertainment, NPR, and Kardec Radio, when he kickstarted with us the series of conversations at Kardec Radio. So we are honored to have this friend with us and to chat with him. We also have here Kirsten DeMello. Kirsten, thank you for joining us. Dr. Gary Schwartz, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a privilege for me to be with you and Kristen and this growing community that is coming together around all of this work.
Yes, it's very exciting. And as you're a great collaborator of the Spiritist movement, you've been to, by now, 7 different events, Spiritist events in the United States. How has it been for you, this experience of expanding your network through the Spiritist community?
You know, it's interesting. Of all the groups that I've had the privilege to come to know through doing this work, I would have to say that for me, the Spiritist group is, in some respects, no pun intended, you're a shining light. And part of the reason for that is that you honor the meaning of all of this, and you do so with such grace, and there's so much love present that, and science. I mean, it's not just it's a very curious bridge integration, and also it's international. It's not U.S. focused. It's not Brazil focused or France focused. It's internationally focused, and it also brings together not just science, but it brings together medicine. It brings together health, and every time and each time that I've had the privilege to participate in your events, I've just felt this overwhelming sense of beauty and caring and love and appreciation and excitement and enthusiasm and youthfulness. As you can tell, I'm a fan.
And you know what? The reality is, and Kirsten and Daniel's sons, Carlos Diaz, are also here. They can tell people they are a big fan of you, right, Kirsten?
Absolutely. It's like a dream team to have you today, Kardec Radio.
Exactly. So people really appreciate, especially because we can tell something that happens quite interesting with you, Dr. Schwartz, is that not only you are a scientist, but you bring your heart with it, which is a very unique combination in science. Being I would say, I say I'm a scientist, but compared to you, I'm an apprentice. And I would say it's really unique, that combination, because we can feel your enthusiasm, and it's like your whole being there when you share your research and the research you've been doing. And I bet there has been a lot of progress recently, right?
Yes, there has been. It's funny, I was thinking about this today, because today is, of course, July 4th, and July 4th for the United States is a very special day.
Yeah.
But it also is very special for our work. and that's why it's propitious that you'd be having this anniversary celebration, and that I was 2 years ago on 4th of July of all days, have been privileged to be the sort of a kickoff speaker for your interviewee for your show. And here it is 2 years later, and I'll explain why this is so meaningful, if I might.
Please.
As you know, because I've had the privilege to share some of this work, the latest work that I've been doing has been not focusing on mediumship per se. In fact, what it does now is it assumes that some people are real, that there are at least some people who are genuine mediums and not frauds. It's funny how you talk about. I heard the phrase "real life." That the greatest spiritual life is called real life. I like that phrase. Well, in that deeper meaning of real, there are fake mediums, literally, people who are trained to be illusionists. Just as a sidebar, when I first started in this work over 15 years ago, I knew that I was told that all mediums were fakes, and I didn't want to be fooled. And so what I did early on was I decided I would learn how to become a fake medium. So I read secret books on how to become a fake medium. I took a course on how to become a fake medium. I'm a pretty good fake medium. So I know what fake mediumship is. Then I could design experiments to eliminate those tricks. And what's happened is I've come to the conclusion, based on these years of research, including single-blind, double-blind, triple-blind studies, that there are real mediums, okay? And these real mediums have experiences of which the most parsimonious explanation is that they really are communing with the greatest spiritual reality. But now, instead of focusing on testing mediums, I'm working with some of the very best mediums who are deeply spiritual, and working with them to attempt to see whether we can develop the technology so that to increase the capacity for anyone and everyone to communicate with real life, with the greatest spiritual reality. And so and this work, by the way, I started out my undergraduate training as an electrical engineer, so I have a strong background in electronics and optics and then computers as they came along. And so I appreciate the if you would, what we call material and energetic aspects of what we call the physical world, but I've been really fascinated with how the if you would, the spiritual realm or real life, how that relates to what we call the physical world, and I began doing research, for example, which I report in my latest book called The Sacred Promise, and have a few publications published in scientific journals, how you can use state-of-the-art technology that can detect single photons of light in a completely pitch-black environment. One of these devices is called a silicon photomultiplier system, which is a technical scientific term for detecting single photons of light with these very stable detectors. They're typically used, these systems are used in biomedical imaging, for example, or in space science. And what I'm doing is using this technology with a group of collaborating, quote, spirits, who we sometimes affectionately refer to as departed hypothesized co-investigators, or our Sacred Promise team, to work with this equipment and work with mediums to see if we could turn this into a highly reliable source for communication. And this is what's kind of funny today, because here we are. I mean, I'm talking now to you on a cordless phone. It's a cordless phone because my landline phone, for some reason, has interference. So I couldn't hear. You could hear me, but I couldn't hear you very well. So I'm using a battery-operated cordless phone, which is going by a wireless connection to the receiver, which is in our kitchen. I'm sitting in the living room. It goes to the kitchen. That then goes by a wire through, ultimately, satellites, and eventually it gets back to first to you, so you and I can communicate, and then by extension, all over the world. As you say, down to 61 countries are currently have the opportunity to be listening in real time. Now, you and I couldn't be having this conversation if we didn't have this technology in the physical, right? And also, it's the case that and because I'm using battery-operated phones, I didn't want the battery to run out. So I have 2 backup phones on the ottoman in the living room. So I'm looking at 3 phones here, which is very amusing. I've never done it like that before. But I'm reminded now of the importance of this, and also the most gifted mediums that I've had the privilege to work with, and the mediums who have been instrumental in and celebrated in the development of Spiritism. None of them are ever 100% accurate. They may be highly accurate at certain times, but it's always a process of tuning in and getting glimpses of information, and hopefully serving as the purest receiver that they can be, not clouded by their own interpretations. And the beauty of a telephone is, hopefully, although my consciousness is obviously clouded by or filtered by my understanding, if I say, "Hello, Vanessa," hopefully you hear, "Hello, Vanessa." It's not filtered by the phone. That process of the communication of the information from me to you is as pure and accurate as possible. So the question is,
so is it like something related to transcommunication, as people say?
Yes, it's like instrumental transcommunication, ITC. It's, if you would, the latest evolution of that. But I didn't get to it via ITC. I learned about ITC in the process of my being led, if you would, quote, independently to these questions. It's just my own personal history. And instead of following the work of ITC, in other words, learning everything that investigators had done in ITC and then building on the work that they did, I did this, quote, independently of that. And the vision that I came to, which I first wrote about in the book, the Afterlife Experiments book, was this vision of the evolution from the cell phone through now the smartphone to what I call the soul phone, the capacity for us to be able to use technology to communicate. And the last thing I was going to make before let you ask questions is to start this work on in sharing is that again, I know very gifted mediums, but if they want to speak to their kids or their parents or me, they don't try to do it psychically, even though they're gifted this way. And even though their children may be gifted or their parents may be connected with them, they still prefer to use the telephone because the telephone is the most accurate form of communication or texting that we have when we're in the physical. And so the goal is not in this work to eliminate mediumship or to eliminate our direct communion with the greatest spiritual reality. Not at all, because there's no substitute for that. But
because actually
you complement.
Exactly,
What?
because even in this case about instrumental transcommunication or any form related to it, you will need, by principle, according to Kardec's works in the medium's book, you will need let's say, the energy of the medium or the ectoplasm to really make it come true through the instruments. So you're talking about, you have the human part of it, you have the material, like the instrument, another venue for it to make it come true by principle. Isn't that right?
Well, it's interesting. This is also what's so, if you would, so much fun for me. Part of the fun of this work, the creative fun, is that although I will read, for example, and I learned about Kardec and the movement because of you, because you introduced me to it, you and your colleagues. I am not a follower of Spiritism or spiritualism or ITC or any of this. What I am is an open-minded questioner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of the reason that that my role is useful in the community that has been building since Kardec is because I approach it not as a devotee of the history,
yes,
but as a devoted seeker of knowledge. And so if Kardec wrote, for example, that the human element is critical in mediumship, it's not that I question that, but what I do is I say, I don't know if that in fact applies to the kind of technology that we're attempting to develop, and so I remain, quote, agnostic, meaning unknowing about whether that's true or not. You see, here's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping, whether I'm depressed or I'm happy or I'm sleepy or I'm highly alert, I hope that the phone will still communicate when I say, hello, Vanessa.
Yes.
I hope that it's not dependent upon my state of mind for the information to be transmitted. And what I want to be able to do, and what my partner, my better half, because she's been doing this with me for the past 7 years as part of the team that we've been developing, is that what we want to be able to do is to, quote, give voice to spirit, particularly the people who have our ancestors, the people who have crossed over, transitioned before we have. I now affectionately refer to these people as post-physical. They were in the physical, and now they're post-physical. Okay? So we got post-physical people. And what we want to do is give them a voice. We want to give them a voice so that they can be heard, hopefully in the purest form possible, and not to be so independent upon the consciousness of the listener. Dependent in terms of the information being heard. Yes, our right hemispheres, if you would, our capacity to be creative, to receive, to understand, to be empathic, that's still essential for us as listeners. And that we have to have the motivation to hear this. But hopefully the transmission process and the relay process could take advantage of the relative stability of what we call the physical world. So our hope is that it's going to be a marriage of human consciousness, spirit, and technology.
It makes sense, but you brought up so many things here, and we have so many questions already. We have questions that were sent actually previously by some of our listeners around the world. But, for example, why do you think, because I think your neutrality, being neutral to it is so important. Often, Gary, people tell me, Vanessa, you're a spiritist, you're a scientist, why don't you start doing research on spirituality? I say, because by principle. Because I believe it personally, I'm defeating the first rule of neutrality in science. So I'm not neutral, and thus everything that I produce is going to be questioned because personally I have a belief. So you told exactly what is very important here, to keep it separate, and at the same time, why do you think it is important for us, as you said, to create a mechanism for the post-physical, we call the discarnates, to communicate with what is the relevance and what is the importance of creating that bridge?
Now you ask, thank you for asking that question. By the way, that is the thesis of the book that is the question that I'm addressing in the book that I'm now writing. And I don't have a firm title, but I do have a firm subtitle, at least, and the subtitle is How the Science of Immortality Changes Everything.
Oh,
and
wow.
How the science of immortality changes everything. And the reason is, I'll give a couple of examples. You see, first of all, I'll talk in general, and then I'll give you an example in terms of how it relates to law, which, by the way, gets back to, maybe if we have a moment, I'll hopefully be able to honor this, gets back to why it's so special that this is you and I are having this conversation on July 4th.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a synchronicity. As you know, I pay attention to coincidence and synchronicity.
Yeah.
And it's a very meaningful one. But first, let me give you these two other comments. The first of all is, when I lecture about my latest book, The Sacred Promise, and I do so regularly, for example, at Canyon Ranch, every other Wednesday night. In fact, I have the privilege to talk about this work, the guests who are there. What I share with people is I share that one of the reasons I chose the term The Sacred Promise was the conclusion that I came to after all this research, that there were a group of, quote, beings, spirits, discarnate, post-physical beings, whatever word you want to use, who not only are trying to show us and establish for us real life, the greatest spiritual reality, but also they're here to help us. They're committed to helping us with our individual and collective problems, including the worldwide problems, global problems.
But allow me to interrupt you for a minute. And this is, of course, I understand this as a spiritist, but from a non-spiritist perspective, or a more, skeptical perspective, a neutral perspective, how do you know that they have something to teach us?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, let's talk about their motivation that's come through the research. And then the question is how. And I'm going to get to the how in a moment, okay? Let's just talk about the why first. Okay. What the research has led me to conclude is that there are a group of people, very distinguished people, well-known named people, people that are household name people, who are, quote, on the other side, and who really care about humanity. They cared about humanity when they were on this planet, and they care about humanity after they've been on the planet. Now, I'm saying this not as a believer. I'm saying this as a scientist. I'm saying this is what the evidence is. See, a scientist has a responsibility to be neutral, but he also has a responsibility to honor data. A scientist is supposed to follow the data where it takes him. And if the data takes him to a new theory, then you have to be an advocate for the new theory as long as it follows the data. So I'm not neutral about data. I'm neutral about belief. So if the data takes us, for example, we used to think the Earth was flat, but then we ended up with evidence saying that the data were round, the Earth was round. We had to give up the idea of a flat Earth and then shift our thinking to a round Earth. Or we used to believe that the sun revolved around the Earth, and that's the way it looked to us as we sit on the planet. But eventually we had to give up that idea because the evidence indicated that it wasn't the sun revolving around the Earth, it was us revolving around the sun. So again, we had to change our mind as a function of the evidence that we learned. Well, if the evidence, the scientific evidence, is now taking us to the conclusion that there's a greater spiritual reality, but more importantly, that there are beings who are really wise and caring and who can help us in solving our individual and collective problems, and they always have. It's just that we've been unconscious of them. Then we are operating under the wrong worldview if we think that we live in a spiritless universe, which is how I was raised, that the problems that we have are our problems to solve. They're only our problems. They're nobody else's problems. That we'll either solve them or not solve them on our own. And then when we die, it's all over, case closed. That's like the flat earth idea. But what if we're wrong? What if instead of living in a spirit-less universe, we live in a spirit-full universe? And so the vacuum is not empty. Quite the contrary. The vacuum is filled with the light of trillions of stars crisscrossing in all directions. That's what astrophysics tells us. It is filled with energy and information of the light. The stars, including the stars that have long since, quote, died. And all that light is present throughout the entire universe. That's why we have astrophysics. So if instead of living in a vacuum, we live actually in an environment teeming with energy and information, we live in a spirit-full universe, then the problems are not simply our problems as in the physical, but it includes the greater spiritual reality. And if we have an expanded and more correct view of reality, then we can better solve our problems. Now, of course, that requires discernment because we have to then know whose advice to take. We have to know who to listen to. So it requires continued, just like you have to go to the right doctor, you have to go to the right lawyer, you have to go to the right accountant, you have to go to the right ethical politician. It's the same thing if you're going to consult with someone, quote, on the other side. But our vision of reality changes. And as a result, we can then maybe have a more accurate model for how the universe works, and therefore how to define and, quote, fix the problems that we face. And I say that as a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? I don't know if I've made that clear or not. You've asked the right question, okay? So then they would say, okay, how can they help us? Well, one of the ways that they can help us is actually to develop the technology that we need to communicate with them. That's one of the ways they can help us. The first way, because we can't do this until we have the technology. But secondly, they have all kinds of information. That's what the evidence suggests. That relates to from philosophy through technology, through solutions to humankind's problems. Because A, these people are very smart, and B, they have a vantage point that you and I don't have in the physical.
Yeah,
they can see things we can see, they can hear things we can hear. Yeah. And so I consider it a pressing need. That's why I wrote the book, The Sacred Promise, with the subtitle, How Science is Discovering Spirit's Collaboration with Us in Our Daily Lives. So what I'm doing is I'm independently living, following a path which curiously is supporting, I would say, the heart and soul of Spiritism. It may not support every single belief, but it's going to support, it appears to be supporting so much of what you do with who you are that I celebrate every day. I really do. I celebrate every day not only the fact that this work is unfolding, but there's a community that you guys are heralding, which is bringing forth this both the history of this knowledge and the evolution of this knowledge to the planet.
It's so fascinating what you're saying. I will quickly open a question that Kirsten or a comment she has, but just to say everything that you're going to find out, according to what we know in Spiritism, it's a natural law of life. So it should merge at some point. And as the Spirits told Kardec, if at some point science says otherwise, forget about us and go with science. So we're prepared, Gary.
Yeah, no, it's funny. And it's when you remind me of those things that I say metaphorically, hallelujah, and again, thank you for letting me be part of the work that you do.
So we're prepared. And Kirsten has a comment and a question for you. Sure. Kirsten, please.
Hi, Dr. Schwartz.
Hi.
What comes to our mind is this idea that you sort of touched on that we felt we could conclude about personal responsibility and duty, and also as physical beings or incarnate beings in the terminology of Spiritism. Do you feel that with all the research you have done that you have realized this personal responsibility and also a sense of duty you have to bring it to the
Do you want to know what's amusing about your question?
Consciousness of others?
Yes, absolutely. You know why that's so beautiful? I thank you for that question.
Sure.
The key phrase is duty. See, I've used the word responsibility for some time, although I don't typically write about that except a little bit in the Sacred Promise, because that's where the science is leading me. That we have a personal responsibility, and not only do I have a personal responsibility when we're here, our responsibility doesn't stop after we, quote, die. It does not cease. Just like our life does not cease, our responsibility does not cease. But even more interestingly is the term duty. I'm in the process of finishing a book with a colleague. His name is Alan Borey. He is a lawyer by training, and he wrote a book called The Common Path, of bridging bridging science, religion, and spirituality. I don't have the words exactly right in the subtitle, but he wrote this book, which was this integrative book, and he ended up drawing a lot from work that I had published in books and articles that I had written, and that's how I came to know him. And he then gave 2 weeks of guest lectures in my Psychology of Religion and Spirituality class last year at the University of Arizona, and we then decided to write a book about truth-seeking. And the working title of this book is now called The Common Path to Truth. We finished the first draft, and it's Moody and Schwartz. And the critical thing is that I was just in Boulder, like 2 weeks ago, a little over 2 weeks ago. We were finishing this, and it was my job to write the introduction and the conclusion. He did most of the work, and it was my job to synthesize, in terms of first draft. And while I was writing the conclusion, and in our conversations as we were reviewing the book and editing the book before I wrote the draft of this, the phrase that came to me was the duty to truth. Do we have not just a responsibility, but a duty? Now, duty is a word that I don't typically use. But it was coming up in my mind that duty implies what? Obligation. It's more than just a responsibility. It's like it's just the right thing to do. And I have come to the conclusion, and I say this as a scientist, not as a religious person, not as an ethicist or the way that I was raised, but that that with rights come responsibilities. And sometimes there are certain core things that are just they're natural law, they're natural processes. If we're going to have children, like I understand that Vanessa and her better half, I always say that to our spouses, are expecting their, I think, first child.
Yes.
Well, when you bring a child into the world, you have a responsibility and a duty to love and care for that child, because it comes with the territory. So I think that we do have a duty, and I think that this duty doesn't have to end and doesn't end with physical death. That's one of the implications of this work, the big implications, and I know that you know that that's true. I think that that's part of why Kardec did after he passed.
Exactly. That's a good point, and everything you're saying reminds me, because you said you read Kardec, but there are books that probably will be very instrumental as well, because they merge a lot about what you're talking about, bringing machines, instruments, like a venue for that conversation with the spirit realm, which is mostly on Andrea Lewis' books. And there is one of them, of three major ones, that is already in English, that talks about an apparatus that he called the psychoscope, in which, and they foresee from the spirit realm writing through Chico Xavier, and one day we're going to have it happen on Earth.
For this? You are now the second person who mentioned this. The last event that I had the privilege to participate in, which I think was in Texas, Dallas, Texas or something.
Yeah.
I heard one of the speakers, and I apologize for not remembering his name, and he mentioned this psychoscope term, because I had never heard it before, briefly in his talk. And he mentioned that there was something written about this. I am going to please ask you if you would email me and give me my reading assignment. And I also encourage you that in one of your future Spiritus magazines to maybe feature an article or do something that is directly out of that work.
That's beautiful. And your openness is fascinating. But there are two more books, one which actually we translated together with a team of the Center in Baltimore and the Spiritus Center in Virginia, which is coming through very soon. It's Andrea Lewis' book, Evolution into Worlds, in which he is very more scientific, and another one that is probably more focused, Mechanisms of Mediumship, that is hopefully to be translated soon. And these are books that certainly will expedite a lot of the understanding on how to put it all together. But we have here Chico Xavier as an example of probably an exception of a medium. As you said, majority of us as mediums we're not like pure filters.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of our consciousness interfering, where
Right.
Chico Xavier is the single example of that we have this far, according to all the research that was done on him, that he was quite pure. But some people send from Brazil, and his name is Guilherme Barros, a question which I think is very foundational to all of your studies. He says that, Kardec quotes this statement that for every fact there is a cause. So what do you, Dr. Schwartz, understand as an intelligent fact? And would really there be an intelligent cause for it? Would it be considered like, it's very foundational, right, for the work you're doing?
Hugely foundational. Because now we're getting into a bit of both logic and philosophy, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because and this has to do with the psychology of inference. So let me take just a couple of minutes, and forgive me for putting my professor hat on. I'm a professor, so I end up becoming a professor, so I apologize to everyone. When we say that A causes B, that is an inference. Meaning, what do we mean when we say that, that A causes B, or, aspirin causes a reduction in pain? What we mean is that A occurs, some event occurs in time, and then at time 2, a second event occurs. And we infer that the presence of A caused the presence of B. So if B occurs, if some event occurs, we infer that it was preceded by a cause. So we didn't say whether that cause was intelligent or not. We just said that something was responsible for the second event occurring, and we attribute it, if we had measured the first one, to the second one. Now, very often, A occurs and then B occurs, but A is not causing B. They're just occurring in sequence, but they're not actually causally related. And one of the ways that you can prove that from a scientific point of view is what you can do, for example, is you can eliminate A or block an effect from A, and B still occurs. In other words, you're showing that B is not dependent upon A. Now, this A, this cause, which is having an effect B, in physics, we typically infer that it's not intelligent. So we say, for example, gravity causes objects to fall to the earth or be held to the earth. Gravity, and the mass of the earth has a gravitational field, and that pulls us, for example, in our physical bodies to the earth. We don't give any intelligence to that. To infer an intelligent cause is a second level of inference, which is not only that there is some cause, but that cause has some intention, that it required some information processing. And the way that I teach that, and I wrote about this in the GOD experiments book, has to do with the cause of order in the universe. And I use a metaphor, for example, of sand paintings. That's how I originally learned it, which are made by Native Americans in North America and South America, and also by other quote, Native tribes worldwide. And let me just briefly give you this example. You and I call it a God box. It's just a bit of a metaphor here. We can take a box or pan, put white sand in it, okay? And then what we can do is we can take black sand and we can put a picture on it. We can, for example, put a cross, or we can put a Jewish star, or we can put a heart or a brain, or we can write the word G-O-D for God, or we can write D-O-G for dog. We can, as an intelligent creator, put a pattern of sand on that black sand on top of the white sand. Now imagine for the moment you come upon a pot, and you open the pot, and it says God, or it says dog, or it shows a heart. The question is, what's the probability that some intelligent being put it there, or could it have occurred just by chance? Well, the argument from a non-intelligent cause person is that, of course, there's some probability that it occurred by chance. However, that argument actually turns out to not to be consistent with the evidence, and you can do an experiment to prove that. And you know, I'm a scientist, so I always say I'm a boring scientist. I have to do experiments. So here's the way that you can prove, establish scientifically, that that this doesn't occur by chance. So we have an intelligent being, and you can each imagine this. Everybody who's listening to this can imagine what would you paint or what would you write on the sand. So now you've all got your god or your dog or your cow or your pigeon or whatever it is that you put on you painted on the top of this thing. Now what we do is we cover the pot and we shake it, and then we open it, and we look to see what's inside. And we cover the pot and we shake it, and we look and see what's inside. And we do this over and over again. And the question is, what happens to the image that was intelligent? We know it was intelligently put on the top because we have a picture of you painting this, and we infer that you're intelligent. And most people wouldn't argue with that. The question is, does the cross become a Jewish star? Does the heart become a brain? Does God become a dog? The answer is no. What happens is, if you think about it, is that the sand mixes. The black dots mix with the white dots, and the more you shake it, the more evenly it distributes. And that happens 100% of the time. 100% of the time. Now, that's called the second law of thermodynamics. Is another way of expressing what's called the second law of thermodynamics. But let me just translate it into the plain English. In the plain English is, in the absence of an intelligent organizing source of information or fields, what the universe does is it mixes. In the absence of something that would impose order and keep that order there, what happens is things mix. So, for example, if we put CO2 atoms in one side of a vacuum and of a vessel, and we put oxygen on the other side, and then what we do is we allow them to intermingle. What happens 100% of the time is the carbon dioxide and the oxygen mix, and they become very quickly infused with each other. So if we approach this from a scientific point of view, we can infer what? That if by chance you're walking along on a desert, or you're walking along on a beach, and you come upon a beautiful sand painting, or you come upon the first couple of words to the Declaration of Independence written in the sand, what's the probability that some intelligent force put it there? Well, the answer is 100%, because order doesn't occur by chance. You see what I'm saying? So we can come to a conclusion. Now, I come to that, again, as a scientist, and someone with a bit of a background in physics. And most of us have not been educated to think that way. Okay? We know intuitively that it's true, but we haven't had the experimental rationale to demonstrate it. And I think that what I've been blessed with is, for some ridiculous reason, to every now and again stumble upon experiments that can speak to these greater truths.
Wow, that's amazing, so profound, and you summarized it so beautifully. And it's interesting because as the tables were turning at Kardec's time, these were the phenomena that were happening. They were turning tables, and they were responding to people's questions. And that's when he came up with that understanding. He was intrigued. At first he was skeptical, and it took him 2 years to actually start investigating. And when he finally did, the first thing that came to his mind was like, if these tables are speaking, they must have a brain, and I know they don't. So he pushed it away. was a brilliant mind, but at the same time,
he was a brilliant mind, and he was also an open mind.
Exactly,
and apparently a loving mind, as far as I can tell.
That is true, because he really combined it all. He didn't leave it aside. He allowed the wholeness of perspectives to come true. But as you're saying, if there is an intelligent effect, what is causing it? So I agree with you. Scientifically speaking, the perspective will call us for a whole building up of a protocol to really address it. But when you're talking about creating these mechanisms to communicate more efficiently, to expedite our progress, can we say it's about expediting progress too when we consider we're working at four hands?
Absolutely. We are, the metaphor that I use is as follows. A little over 110 years ago, there were no airplanes, okay? And we human beings didn't know if we could fly with powered flight. And, the assumption has always been, as you know, the story's been that, if God exists and if God invented us to fly, we would have had wings. And so, therefore, by that simple logic, we would infer that, we're not meant to fly. Meanwhile, of course, we could use the same logic and say, but if there is a God, if there's an intelligence, a universal intelligence, and this God gave us the intelligence to be able to learn how to fly, then, in fact, we were meant to fly, and it's our duty to learn how to do this because it was the gift of intelligence. So, as you know, there was one day, and many people had tried to fly and failed. But then on December 1903, 5 people witnessed the first Wright brothers flight, just 5. And the first flight, there were 4 flights that day. The first one lasted all of 12 seconds. The longest one was 59 seconds. The second time they tried to do it, it failed because it required a minimum amount of breeze to initially get the plane off. The third time they tried it, it worked. And all
Dear listener, we're experiencing just a technical difficulty here. Probably the battery of the Dr. Schwartz has ran out, but we're going to call him in a minute. So for the time being, we're going to give a short break. When we come back, Dr. Gary Schwartz and much more.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Available for purchase, the book, This Obsession, psychographed by the medium Francisco Cândido Xavier. In this book, the spirit André Luiz recruits new groups of workers of goodness whose intent is to aid in the readjustment of those no longer in the physical plane. Learn more by purchasing your copy at www.sgny.org.
Kardec Radio, live, every Saturday at 11 a.m.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
Listen to our sister radio, Bazera Online Web Radio, retransmitting Kardec radio shows 3 times a day. Also beautiful and inspiring programs in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Go to www.spiritist.com.
And now we return to our program.
Dear listener, we are here talking to Dr. Gary Schwartz about so many great things. He was in the middle of his thought when the call dropped, but he's still here with us. Dr. Schwartz, the line is open for you again.
Oh, thank you. Well, since you've asked me to complete this, I would love to. We were talking about the Wright brothers flight, and that there were 4 flights that day. The longest one lasted 59 seconds. And although it was reported in the newspapers, there were pictures even taken. It took a couple of years before the world finally believed that this was true. Now, think about this. However, for the people who were there, those 5 people who witnessed it, there was no longer any question about whether flight was possible. The question is, what would it become? And this is what I ask my audiences to do when I talk about this toward the end of my lecture about the sacred promise. I say, imagine that it's 1903, December, and all of us, we're at Kitty Hawk. Now, there are no cell phones then. There were no fancy lights or cars or any of the internet or any of the things that we take for granted. There were no major electric lights like we take for granted. It was very primitive. Could we have imagined then that in a few short generations there'd be these gigantic machines carrying hundreds of people, traveling 24/7 worldwide, almost completely safely? Could we have imagined that literally last year over 74 million people flew? Could we have imagined, for example, that every second one of these gigantic machines would be taking off and landing? Then I make a little joke, and I say, could we have imagined that for a brief period of time you could get a good meal on a plane? And then I ask people to imagine that radio would be invented and come to planes, and television, and then iPads and iPhones and the World Wide Web and noise-canceling headphones. Hello?
Okay, Dr. Schwartz, you can continue. So we couldn't imagine all these advancements, right, happening today. Okay, dear listener, we're experiencing the putting together of three great minds all together, Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Eben Alexander, and Dr. Raymond Moody Jr. And the fascinating part of it is that we have friends here who are all over the world contacting to Kardec Radio, like Sandra Musi from the Canada Spiritist Movement. She shared a lot of great things here with us since the beginning. She said, congratulations, very happy to hear know that we have this great way to celebrate, to spread Spiritism in North America and the world. And she also shared she knows Dr. Schwartz. And we have also a friend, Karina Alice from Brazil, contacting us. Thank you, Karina, for being constantly here at Kardec Radio. And we have a question by Ed Amaya, and we were going to open the line to you very soon. We're going to give a very short break, but when we come back, we're going to have here Dr. Eben Alexander III, Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Raymond Moody Jr., much more for you, especially on the conversations with Dr. Moody Jr. and Eben Alexander.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Spiritist Network, your gateway to on-demand Spiritist videos. www.spiritistnetwork.com.
Spread the word. Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.
Want to find a good way to explain life after physical death to kids or teenagers? Check out the book Message from a Teen in the Spirit World by the Spirit Neo Lucio and Psychograph by Chico Xavier. In this book, a teenager named Carlos explains his impressions on the new life in the spirit realm with his discarnate relatives and new friends. Purchase your copy online at www.ssbaltimore.org.
The Spiritist Magazine is a trimestral, digital periodical that publishes the latest news on the Spiritist thought and the movement in the USA and worldwide. Subscribe now at www.spiritistmagazine.com.
Listen to our sister radio, Bazera Online Web Radio, retransmitting Kardec Radio shows 3 times a day. Also, beautiful and inspiring programs in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Go to www.spiritist.com.
In the book A Primer on Being Good by the Spirit May May, psychographed by the medium Chico Xavier, explains in simple language appropriate for children two paths in life, the path of good or the path of evil. God has granted us the freedom to choose either one. Purchase your copy online at www.ssbaltimore.org.
Now we return to our program. We will return to our program after these messages.
Come and listen to our CD, Unfolding Our Spiritual Nature, Path of Harmony, by Dr. Raul Texera. The CD has questions and answers on euthanasia, suicide, pain relief, past life therapy, prayer and better attunement, law and affinity, the spirit world, raising our thoughts, and much more. You can purchase the CD by visiting SSB online bookstore at www.ssbaltimore.org.
Known as one of the most scientific books by Allan Kardec, The Genesis dives deeper into the origins of our planet to the advent of the new generations to come. Purchase your copy today, online or via your ebook reader. Go to www.ediceiofamerica.com today.
Nourish Your Soul with Kardec Radio.
Now in English, the book Action and Reaction by the Spirit Andrea Louise, psychographed by Chico Xavier. Buy your copy online or via your ebook reader. Go to www.ediceiofamerica.com today.
And now we return to our program.
Dear listener, we are here to talk with Dr. Eben Alexander, Dr. Gary Schwartz, Dr. Raymond Moody Jr. While we hook up the other friends, we already have here with us Dr. Eben Alexander III, the best-selling author of the book Proof of Heaven. Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander, for being with us at Kardec Radio today.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
We're hooking up with Dr. Moody Jr. in a few. For the time being, we'd like to open the conversation with you about the series, right, that you and him are putting together, and it's being released. I think it was just released on the website of Raymond Moody Jr. Conversations.
Yes,
with Raymond Moody Jr.?
It's really Ray's series. He is the mastermind behind that, and we started with an interview that he did with me several months ago.
Yes, but in your case specifically, you're a neurosurgeon. For the listeners who are, I doubt if they are not, but I'll just repeat briefly your background. You are a neurosurgeon, educated at Duke University Medical School, currently living practicing privately in Lynchburg, Virginia, and you were a faculty at the Harvard Medical School until the year 2001. And you had a life-changing experience, actually a near-death experience, and then you felt like writing the book that became actually bestseller, and it's the top one in the New York Times best-selling list. So can you tell us a little bit about your own experience about near-death experiences?
Yes, well, I think it's important to point out that, in my career over more than 2 decades in academic neurosurgery, I thought I had a pretty good idea of how the brain and mind and consciousness work. And it turns out that my near-death experience had occurred a little over 4.5 years ago now, completely shifted that. And the real gift is not so much that I'm an MD. The real gift is that I had a very severe bacterial meningitis. It was a very rare meningitis. It was one caused by E. coli, which normally would be expected in less than 1 in 10 million people per year. Very rare, and I was driven rapidly into coma within a few hours. And to have that, any kind of bacterial meningitis and be driven into coma within hours, you're already well below a 10% chance of surviving it. And so I went into the hospital already in coma, and had an experience that if you'd asked me before my coma, how much would such a patient whose neocortex has been heavily damaged diffusely by bacterial meningitis, what would they experience and remember? I would tell you nothing. And in fact, I describe in my story a realm that's very kind of coarse and primitive that I label the earthworm's eye view, that I believe was the best consciousness that my brain could actually muster, while the whole neocortex was being destroyed by this infection. And that's important because any other disease or injury that might have put me into coma would not enable me to so readily go through hypotheses trying to explain this as a brain-based phenomenon, which, of course, I tried to do for months after my coma. I was my own worst skeptic, trying to explain it as a brain-based disorder, trying to somehow show how such a hallucination or dream or confabulation could occur. And that's where the problem lies, because, in fact, being that ill with something that's that damaging to the neocortex, in fact, it truly opened up my awareness to a much richer level. As I told my older son, who was majoring in neuroscience, it was way too real to be real, and that's what it seemed like. And I thought there's got to be some lesson in there about consciousness, brain, and mind. And that's why it was so stunning, because after many months going through my medical records, going through everything with colleagues, trying to come up with a brain-based explanation, I realized, well, it was too real to be real, because it was. And I describe a lot of that spiritual journey in the gateway and in the core in the book in great detail. But it's very much a situation that I would have told you was impossible before my coma, and yet there are tens of thousands of other near-death experiences out there that are very similar. That before I would have dismissed as, some trick of the dying brain. I now realize that that is a woefully inadequate, inept attempt at trying to explain these very rich phenomena that I think mine really just validates thousands of other such reports.
It's so interesting for the listener who is not fully aware about the standards in medicine. When we consider somebody who is brain dead, can you tell the listener what it really means?
Well, I think the important thing to understand is that by taking the whole surface of the brain, the outer surface or neocortex, that part is, some part of that must be working according to modern neuroscience for you to have any kind of a detailed conscious awareness in the moment. And that's why the more I got into my medical records, going through my scans, my neurologic exams, talking with my doctors, I started to realize that my neocortex was actually heavily damaged even from the beginning, from the first, literally within the first few hours, there was no significant neocortical function left. And that's the problem, is how in the world do you explain a very rich, transcendent, detailed tapestry of conscious awareness that in many ways is much greater than my fully healthy brain could muster as an experience in reality even now. And that part is very, very difficult to explain when the whole neocortex is being attacked by this illness. And to this day, my doctors, I think, would agree that there's really no explanation for how I had this full recovery. I mean, by the end of that week, I had started with about a 10% chance of survival, and then did not respond to 3 very powerful antibiotics for several days, and was finally starting to show just a glimmer of a turnaround in my systemic illness, but without any turnaround in my neurologic function. And they had put me on sedating medications, and that's a point of confusion for some people, because I was already unresponsive and beyond knowing and remembering anything when I was put on those meds. So it was not because of the medications that I was disabled from knowing anything in this world. It was because I was in coma due to bacterial meningitis. And even as those medications were removed towards the end of that week, I was not showing the return of neurologic function that they were hoping to see. And, that's when on day 7, I was on a ventilator that whole time, and on day 7 is when I did start coming back. And it was with an extraordinary memory of this journey in my mind. And in fact, on that morning when I was starting to come back to this world, it did take several days for my brain, which had been badly damaged, to do the kind of recovering that allowed me to at least, be present and start manifesting anything of being human again. And I remembered vividly everything that had happened deep in coma in this extraordinary journey, but did not remember anything of my life before. In fact, initially when I was waking up, even my language was just beginning to come back. It came back over hours and days, and a lot of my childhood memories over many weeks, but knowledge of everything I'd learned in decades of neurosurgery about neuroscience, consciousness, and mind and brain, didn't really return fully, I don't believe, for about 6 weeks or so after my coma. And during all that time, I've been busily writing down everything I could remember from deep in my coma journey.
Wow, that's fascinating. So there are so many conclusions to already take from your experience, but we're going to open the line finally. Our friend Kirsten de Mello, Daniel Santos, they got Dr. Moody Jr. here with us. Let's open the line. Hi, Dr. Moody Jr. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hello, how are you? Good to hear from you again.
Wonderful. It's great to celebrate the 4th of July with you, Dr. Eben Alexander. And, today we also have with us Dr. Gary Schwartz, who actually kick-started the program, the anniversary program today, and we invited him just to take over into a broader conversation with the two of you as well. Dr. Schwartz, thank you for being here with us as well.
It's a privilege to be with all of you.
Yes, likewise. Yeah, thank you. Hello, Eben, and hello, Gary, too.
Oh, hello there, Raymond and Gary. Good to hear both of you.
It's great. We have your great minds to share so much with our audience in more than 61 countries around the world. And we have so many questions already sent to us by the listeners. But let us take from where Dr. Alexander left off. The possible shift in paradigm, which would probably be proposed by his own experience. He was sharing about his experience in the near-death experience from a medical as a neurosurgeon. There is no actual explanation at this point. And before we brought Dr. Alexander, we had Dr. Gary Schwartz talking about new frontiers that are being opened up as we proceed in these experiments. So can we tell Dr. Moody Jr., Dr. Alexander, Dr. Schwartz that we are facing a critical time in which we need to open our doors for a new paradigm?
Well, I'm happy to comment on that. This is Raymond Moody, and that yes, I think if you look back at the history of rational investigation of life after death, it has not really been a very successful endeavor, and I think it kind of got off the track in the 19th century with a premature leap to scientific method rather than just rational procedure. But with that out of the way, I got to say that I think now that I'm confident to say that there have been real breakthroughs in the possibility of genuinely rational investigation of an afterlife, and that basically I think what we can do now is we can equip human beings with entirely new conceptual systems that enable them when just by chance, subsequently, for example, they had a near-death experience just by chance, but they went into it pre-prepared with new ways of thinking. I think we can actually affect the structure of near-death experiences as they are subsequently reported to us. So, but that's just one thing. Yeah, I think a new paradigm is not an exaggeration. That is a phrase that a lot of time people sort of leap to that, I think a little quickly. But I've talked about this with Eben, actually, and Eben is a little familiar with my work on trying to rearrange the concepts. And I think that we ought to just sort of issue a challenge and say, hey, there's something here, and let's talk about it.
Exactly.
I'd like to compliment that.
Yes, please.
But I'd like to compliment, I think, and extend what Raymond is saying. In fact, one of the labels for this new paradigm, which I first heard from a Columbia professor by the name of Lisa Miller, who recently edited the Oxford Handbook of the Psychology of Spirituality, and it's called post-materialist science, or post-materialism. And it's a vision that is actually consistent with Kardec's work and also consistent with a lot of early philosophies, and yet provides a framework that is encompassing enough that can include the brilliant both philosophical and empirical work that Raymond is doing. And this post-materialism vision, of course, basically says that our fundamental idea that what's real is material and that it's primary, that idea is actually mistaken and that we've got it backwards. It's not consciousness is created by matter, but if anything, what we call matter or organized energy is created by consciousness.
Yeah.
And it turns out that vision, which is sort of like, who revolves around whom, the sun revolving around the earth or the earth revolving around the sun. I mean, when you completely twist it around, the question is, can the evidence be seen as consistent with that? And it turns out to be yes. And I'd like to just take 1 minute to share, I think, an important logical framework, which I'd really like Raymond and Eben's opinion about. And here's a very quick story. There are three kinds of paradigms in neuroscience. It's the paradigms that we use. And those paradigms, you can think of them as correlation, stimulation, and ablation. So in other words, there are three different ones. So correlation means, for example, you shine a light in somebody's eye, and you measure brain waves, and you see, sure enough, that there's a correlation between what they see and what they show. Straight correlation. Or if you imagine a light and you do neuroimaging, you find activation in the occipital region. So there's a correlation between psychological experience and that thing. Then there's stimulation. We either used to do that with electrodes, or now we can do it with magnetostimulators. You stimulate regions of the brain and people have visual experience. And then the third is ablation. You remove part of that either surgically or because of injury, and people lose selective sight. Now, those three kinds of evidence typically lead us to think that consciousness is in the brain. You with me so far?
Yes. Absolutely, and you're talking pure
now,
David Hume
I just want to make sure. Right.
Absolutely
now,
right.
Now, let me tell you what's wrong with that.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that is that those data are also completely consistent with the idea that the brain is an antenna receiver for consciousness.
Yeah.
And I learned that many years ago when I started out as an electrical engineering student, as an undergraduate, because we do the same kind of experiments with television sets or with anything else now. We do correlation studies. We put a lead and an oscilloscope on a particular tube or a particular transistor, and we have a correlation between the electrical signals that are picked up and what we see on the screen. And then what we do is we do stimulation studies. I made a little stimulator, a generator, and you stimulate the tube and you see light coming up on the screen. And then we do ablation studies. We remove the tube, we remove the transistor, and lo and behold, there's a selective deficit in the TV. However, is that therefore proof that the television is creating the signal? Of course not. We know that, in fact, the TV is an antenna receiver for the signal. So the take-home message is that although correlation, stimulation, and ablation, which are the three paradigms that neuroscientists use, is consistent with the idea that the brain creates consciousness, it is equally consistent with the idea that the brain is not the creator of consciousness, but some sort of an antenna receiver
projection
filter of consciousness. Exactly. Now, if that's the case, how do we prove that? Well, we need additional experimental paradigms. Now, in the case of the television, for example, what we do is we create a shield, for example. We block the signal, and then we show that the TV loses the signal, so it's coming from outside the head. Or what happens in the case of a television, you break your television and it dies. Another television can still pick up the signal.
So that's where I started thinking about, for example, mediumship research, which is an experimental paradigm, is a test of this post-materialist science. Because if the theory was that consciousness is a creation of the brain, then when the brain dies, consciousness dies, case closed. But if the brain is more like an antenna receiver for consciousness, and that theory, by the way, was developed by Dr. William James from Harvard, who was a physician, and he was the first professor of psychology. That idea was adopted by Dr. Wilder Penfield, a neurosurgeon up at McGill. It was adopted by Sir John Eccles, who won the Nobel Prize for the study of the neuron. These very brilliant men independently came to the conclusion that the brain acted more like an antenna receiver than it did as a creator. And mediumship studies were one paradigm for testing this defining characteristic of which theory is better. Does the sun revolve around the earth, which is the way it looks to us under normal circumstances, or is the earth really revolving around the sun? And the mediumship research, the near-death experience research, our new technology research, it's all leading to that kind of conclusion, the alternative conclusion, if you would quote the new paradigm. And what I love about this is that we can use our current understanding to get us to this greater vision.
So in this
I'm curious
case,
about Raymond
yes,
yes,
Dr. Moody Jr., Dr. Alexander, would you address?
Well, I would say absolutely. And you know what this is really all boiling down to is where I got stuck on this question at the beginning as an undergraduate student of philosophy, and that is that the real problem here is a philosophical question. I mean, as Gary's discussion, I think is kind of builds up to this, that really it's just a philosophical stance, how you regard the consciousness as being connected with the material substance of the body. And I mean, you know, there's so many great figures who've commented on this. Plato said that, you know, our essence of our being is a conscious soul that kind of inhabits the body temporarily. Or Descartes, you know, with the idea of dualism, that both mind and matter are real, but that they interact. And all kinds of philosophical points of view, or going to the sort of the ultimate pole of it, the notion of idealism, that what is primary reality is mind, and ideas in mind, and consciousness. And that's where I've always kind of been intuitively since I was a kid. So I think, yes, I mean, and there are rational ways to investigate this. And I can almost hear Gary's frustration that this sort of mechanical model that gets taught about scientific method neglects the larger truth that if you look at the history of thought, there have always innovative people have come around who find out new ways of investigating things. And here we are stuck on this roughly 400-year-old idea that, you know, of scientific method, which all lets cheer. Yeah, I mean, science is terrific and great. And then there is the fact beyond that it's 400 years old. Reason has been around for a long time. And to start thinking that everything has to fit into this one mechanical model of scientific inquiry, ultimately that's just kind of ridiculous if you look at the history of Western thought. And so, you know, the point, we are on the verge here of finding out entirely new ways of investigating this that are entirely rational, but that sort of transcend the limits of you know, merely mechanical type scientific inquiry.
Well, what I would do, Raymond, is just qualify this in one important way, and then I'll be quiet here. And I just want to make sure that the point is not lost, that it's not simply so much the inadequacy of, if you would quote, science or even mechanistic science. The inadequacy is in our thinking through how we interpret what we get. And you see, neuroscience has this limited view where they jump to the conclusion that these three kinds of experiments point only to the idea that the brain creates consciousness. Once you realize and have the understanding that even within, quote, conventional science, we know there's an alternative theory, which is equally consistent with those data, equally consistent, and therefore you have to do additional kinds of experiments. That enables us to use the scientific method to take us back to Plato and to see Plato in a greater light.
And then let us bring now, as you're saying about the scientific perspective, let us bring to the experiential part of it. Since Dr. Eben Alexander has experienced it, and if we can go back to his case, and then from there we continue developing. Dr. Alexander, you and Dr. Moody Jr. have been putting together this video series that has been produced with the help of the filmmaker David Hinshaw, and people can get a hold of it by going to Dr. Raymond Moody Jr.'s website, raymondmoodijr.org. But if we go to this discussion and to the very experience, Dr. Alexander, according to what you said, beyond just the reasoning of what may have happened, you talk about the fact that you identify a mysterious angel who was your guide during that time in which you were considered dead, physically speaking. Can you tell us more about it so we can now discuss this from an experiential point of view as well?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I really am fascinated by this wonderful discussion, these points that Gary and Raymond have brought up, because for me, as I said earlier, that the fact that I could have such an extraordinary spiritual experience that seemed to me to go on for months. I mean, this is a long odyssey that happened during that 7 days that I was on the ventilator in Koba. And to have that kind of experience, especially when I would have told you that the next step beyond that primitive earthworm eye view, that very coarse, unresponsive realm that it all started in, the next step beyond that I would have expected to have been nothingness. And that's why it was so shocking that, in fact, the blinders came off, and I was awakened into a far grander, richer, more vibrant, and ultra-real experience than I could ever have imagined. And it's getting to exactly this discussion of mind and brain and what is primary. Because I came to realize, especially in the months after my coma, in trying to analyze it, trying to explain how it could have happened, and then finally realizing, after going through multiple hypotheses, trying to describe how this might have arisen in my physical brain, I came to realize that what really happened was that the veil, as I call it, was taken down. That filter that I believe Gary was referring to was actually taken down. And so, in fact, I became much more, my awareness became much less limited. It was much more into that consciousness that is the primary thing that exists. And I've had to learn a lot more than I ever needed to know about consciousness. You know, some of my critics and skeptics have attacked me and said, well, he's only a neurosurgeon. He doesn't know neuroscience. Well, I promise you, I've done a lot of homework over the last 4.5 years about consciousness and about the enigma of quantum mechanics, because it all works together. And in fact, become very knowing about what's called the hard problem of consciousness. And I would say the hard problem of consciousness is probably the deepest and arguably the most unanswerable question for human brain and mind, and certainly the kind of scientific materialist approach that holds sway now in conventional science. That the hard problem is absolutely stunning in how challenging it is once you get deeply into it. And it can be phrased quite simply, and that is that of all the people who study mind and brain, and you know, this debate, the mind and brain, has been going on for more than 26 centuries. And for all the modern thinkers, scientists, philosophers, theologians who are aware of the deepest issues about mind and brain and consciousness, what they come to realize is that there's no one on earth who can give you the first sentence to describe how the physical brain might give rise to consciousness. And that is a crucial red flag that really puts an absolute stop to pure scientific materialist thinking as an explanation of the universe and existence, especially because the only thing any one of us truly knows exists is our own consciousness. And so if our thought models cannot even begin to explain the basis of the only thing we truly know exists, I would say that scientific materialism is not really in a position to be offering up a theory of everything. And of course that's very misleading, that current physicists and cosmologists can even put out there that they might be close to a theory of everything when they cannot even begin to explain the phenomenon of consciousness. And of course, it gets much worse when you start to realize that non-local consciousness not mired down in the here and now and kind of the shackles of the physical brain, non-local consciousness is very real. And, I'm talking about phenomena like telepathy, precognition, near-death experiences, after-death communications, reincarnation, past life memories, out-of-body experiences, remote viewing. I mean, the list is long as can be. And I urge people interested to go to eternea.org, eternia.org, and then also lifebeyonddeath.net, my website, to learn more about this and to see reading lists and see more interviews that discuss this in much more detail. And, of course, the wonderful book, Irreducible Mind, for Psychology for the 21st Century, which is by Ed Kelly, Emily Kelly, Bruce Grayson, and the whole group at UVA. And then that wonderful book that's a little lighter for the non-scientist, Consciousness Beyond Life, by Pim Van Lommel. But non-local consciousness and these phenomena are very real, and they point out that consciousness is a much deeper mystery, that my little primitive thinking that I had before my coma, that brain creates consciousness, and that it's just a matter of time before we can explain consciousness if we study the brain in detail, is false. And I now realize that consciousness is a much deeper mystery, that in fact it's enriched when it is freed up from the brain and mind, such as happens at the time of physical death. But also we can come to know that through practice that enriches getting in touch with consciousness, which can be deep meditation, centering prayer, sometimes what I call the gift of desperation, and that is where many of the answers will lie about coming to know these deeper truths.
And so, as you're saying this, it's so fascinating. We want to tease even deeper all of our minds to get how much of these experience on near-death experience and how much these studies on near-death experience have actually can bring a new understanding on mental health. Dr. Moody Jr., would you like to start addressing this?
Well, yes. I think spiritual experiences can enlighten us about mental illness, but almost in a negative way. That is, my original degree, I think, as we know, was I was a philosophy professor, but I am also a psychiatrist, and but by the time I went to medical school in 1972, I had already been investigating these near-death experiences for a long time because they are part of the basis of the entire Western way of thinking. The Greek philosophers were very well aware of these near-death experiences, so that was my point of entree. And so I had talked with lots and lots of people by the time I started medical school and then subsequently psychiatry residency. And, I've talked with a lot of mentally ill people, and including I was the medical director of as a forensic psychiatrist of a maximum security unit for the criminally insane. So I really did see the utter extremes of mental illness. And my impression always has been near-death experiences and mystical consciousness and that sort of thing really don't have anything to do with mental illness. I mean, these are really just sort of two different categories of existence, I think. And what happens to people who really are not very well informed about mental illness or about spiritual experiences is that they may hear somebody talking about getting out of their body and going through a tunnel into a light or whatever, and they their untutored judgment is something like, oh, that person was crazy or whatever, which is a way basically of mental laziness, so that they don't have to think about it anymore. Because although I think probably everybody listening to this broadcast is in tune with the idea of life after death, there's a lot of people out there for whom it's just superstition and silliness. And but my experience as a psychiatrist really was that they didn't teach, hearing all those near-death experiences didn't teach me very much about my mentally ill patients. One thing I did notice, however, was that people who had profound near-death experiences turn out to be less neurotic than the ordinary population. They seem more fulfilled and more open and so on. And my friend Eben, for example, who is, it's kind of like having a friend who is a happy young person. He's just so delightful in his openness, and just has a full range of emotions like all of us. So, Eben would be one of the people that I would put way on the end of the scale, away from mental illness, and in some ways he's almost too mentally healthy. Just very cheerful and bubbly and energetic and nice guy. So I don't think they have very much to do with each other, actually.
Raymond, can I ask you a question? But the implications, Dr. Moody Jr., about that experience and what it means to all of us could probably give a new light to mental health. And I'll open it up and allow Dr. Schwartz to make a comment.
Yes, it's funny. I started my training in clinical psychology, and I was also in first-year medical school. And I remember, as part of my training in clinical psychology and psychopathology, that I went to a state hospital, and one of the first patients that I interviewed, who was diagnosed as a hallucinating schizophrenic, told me with great assurance that Elvis Presley was in the room with us. Mm-hmm. And she pointed him out, and she had conversations with him and so on. And what I was taught then, which was also the bias that I was raised in, was that if anybody experienced anything that was remotely spiritual, it was by definition a hallucination. It was by definition an illusion. It was by definition a misperception. And consequently, those experiences needed to be minimized, suppressed, labeled as pathology, and so on. Now we can recognize that at least some of those experiences may actually be genuine, that people that we call mediums or intuitives, I'm talking about the real ones, not the fake ones, that they're not mentally ill. Quite the contrary, they've just, as Eben said, they've opened their filters, but they can also shut them down, and they're in charge of it, and they're not frightened by it. They're not terrified of it. And so this whole business of now differential diagnosis of people who are having spiritual experiences, instead of labeling it all as mental illness, some of it may actually be a sign of a greater awareness.
Yes, that is true. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, please.
So I was just curious how either of you also feel about this. To what extent does this expand our understanding of consciousness and also what we define as illness?
Yeah, well, who knows what illness is really? There's I often think that if you look back 150 years, and there was a kid up on the hey, wagon or something saying, "Hey, Dad, I can't work today. I've got an allergy or I've got the sniffles." You know, he would receive a strong whack and say, "Get back up on that wagon." Whereas nowadays, you know, there's entire medical specialty trained to take care of our sniffles and little itches and so on. So that is constantly shifting. But I think spiritual experience is something that is in a pretty stable category. I mean that, you know, this has been around with us for a long, long, long time. And so in respect to your remark that can this, or your comment whether this can, near-death experiences, for example, can give us any enlightenment on mental illness, I think that one way to look at it is to give people hope. I mean, in the sense that one thing we can't yet argue from near-death experiences, for example, can't yet rationally argue that there is conclusively a life after death. However, we can't argue it the other way either. And so these near-death experiences at least give people hope. It's not at all irrational for somebody to look through to look at these experiences and listen to people and to reason from them as a sort of best estimate of what to make of them, that there is an afterlife. I mean, that's not at all irrational. So what these things offer is hope for people who are mentally ill.
Exactly. And as
Eben,
we're saying, yeah, go ahead, Dr. Schwartz.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It's very hard when we can't see each other if we ask questions.
I know.
You started with the question, for example, of Eben's deep experience with something that was angelic to him. And I was wondering if Eben would like to talk about a little bit about that experience, and how does he think that he came to the conclusion that this was, quote, angelic-like. And part of the reason I share this is because in the book that I wrote called The Sacred Promise, in the last quarter of the book, I addressed the, quote, angel hypothesis as an experimental psychologist and psychophysiologist. And I take people through data that forced me to entertain the hypothesis that this realm might be a, quote, real realm as well, and that it was open to, quote, science, not just personal experience, but also science.
I think it's a very good point. I can tell you, as a card-toting reductive materialist neuroscientist, I've had to completely revise how I see kind of human soul, spirit, consciousness, and the physical world, and the brain, and every other part of this physical material world, and have, in my view, the most straightforward way of seeing it is realizing that consciousness is actually something that it is the most real aspect of all that exists, and that consciousness at its core is the thing that generates all of the rest of this. And that I would say that for me it's simplest to see that our consciousness at deeper and deeper levels becomes one, and in fact becomes one with the divine. And it's very clear to me that in fact our soul or spirit and our conscious awareness is actually allowed a much grander view of kind of unstuck in the here and now of the physical brain and the mind, dumbed down on this side of the veil, when the body dies, when the body and brain die, and that in fact I think it's best to try and understand how all this really works, to take these near-death experiences and take other phenomena of non-local consciousness, but for today we're talking especially about near-death experiences, and just entertain that maybe people are telling you, maybe souls who've been on these journeys are telling you something that is very real. And that's exactly what I hope my book helps to do, is to open up the door so that people will entertain that. For one thing, realizing that our conventional materialist science is clueless on any explanation of how consciousness might emerge from the physical brain in the first place. And that should definitely open the door that it's not creating that consciousness at all. And so I think it's important to get that. Now, for me, as I said, I went through many months of kind of wrestling with this, really as my own worst skeptic. I did all that homework, the kind of pseudo-skeptics come out of the woodwork now to try and criticize my experience and say it was obviously a dream or hallucination. Well, they obviously don't realize how much work I did with colleagues and with my physicians and scans and exams and everything else about my disease to try and explain it as brain-based. And the problem is it's not. It really, and that actually I see the kind of awareness and the seeing how consciousness is the primary thing that exists, that soul and spirit are eternal, actually goes a long way towards helping science, our conventional science, to move beyond what's called the hard problem of consciousness and the enigma of quantum mechanics, because both of those start to become much more tractable issues when you start to realize, just as you've already mentioned Eccles and Sir James Jeans is another one who, beautiful quote from him about the universe starts to look more like a great thought than a great machine, because there does seem to be, and physics community is deeply into knowing this for the last 5 decades at least, that pure information seems to be kind of the core of all that is. And for me, it's a very simple step going from pure information to this all-loving deity, an all-powerful, all-knowing, and infinite deity at the core of it all, that not only I report, but tens of thousands of other near-death experiencers report, finding the same thing, and of course religious mystics and prophets going back thousands of years, really talking about the same thing. And when you start to realize that maybe that really exists, and of course there are many people of faith who have known this forever, they never question it, but for the scientists out there, this actually works in the favor of science. When you can leap far enough out there and truly realize what's going on with the hard problem of consciousness, it helps us to get to a whole new level. For me, as I report in the book, the real catalyst that helped me to have that paradigm shift of completely converting the way I see this to make more sense was that shocking revelation that I came to about the identity of that beautiful companion on the butterfly wing. And I don't want to, spoil it for those who want to read the book, but it is all about getting shocked totally out of my previous mindset in such a powerful way that I now realize something that's much closer to the truth. And, of course, that's what I'm reporting in the book. But I see it as very much a pathway that allows us to reconcile science and spirituality, and so much of my book and my talks are all about tearing down the false boundaries, the boundaries between spirituality and science, boundaries between spirituality and religion, and the boundaries between the various religions in so many ways are man-made false boundaries. They're basically from simplistic thinking, and it's by taking these boundaries down and coming to a much deeper knowing of what consciousness is and who we truly are as beings that allows us a much grander view that's not so conflicted and confused as my view was before my coma.
This is so beautiful what you're saying, Dr. Alexander, because it goes hand in hand with Allan Kardec when in 1857, at a most critical time, now science, I often say that at his time, science and religion were divorced for eternity. And now finally we are coming at a time when probably they are contemplating dating sometimes, maybe. And that's when we call spirituality as this way to bridge them both. But at the time, in a very visionary way, in the conclusion of the Spirit's book, he says that all these phenomena that you were talking about, he doesn't say near-death experience because it was coined recently in our modern times by Dr. Moody Jr., but he visionarily could foresee, and he says in the conclusion of the book, that all these phenomena will shed light on sciences, and especially in psychology. So the ultimate question for us is, as the three of you have already talked briefly about it, but can we say at this point that we have somewhat evidence to say that consciousness does not depend on the brain and that it's freed from the brain?
Well, since nobody is starting, maybe that's an indication that, it's a big question. I'm conservative on this. I mean, and conservative and just in the sense that I think the best thing you can do always is just strictly to follow rational procedure. And what I would say is that in 2013, that we're not yet in a position to say as a conclusive rational proof that there is an afterlife. But also I think that we can say in 2013 that we are closer to it than we ever have been in history, and that there actually are defendable, rigorous, rational systems in which we can now investigate the question of life after death in a genuinely and rational, or genuinely and rigorous rational way that has never been before possible. And that, I think, to me, that's a very, very interesting and hopeful development. And I think from talking with Eben, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Eben, but it sounds sort of like that's what you think too.
I would agree completely. So I said, to me, this kind of understanding about consciousness being a far deeper mystery and more profound phenomenon, and in fact likely the basis of all that is, it starts to help science to move to that next level. And here I'm talking about science with a capital S, and not a science that is, in my view, far too simplistic, that says that by simply understanding, how electrons, protons, quarks, neutrons, photons interact, physics, chemistry, biology, we can explain everything, but actually understanding that fundamentally spirit, soul, consciousness is at the core of all that is controlling and unfolding that grander physical universe. The analogy I use in my book is it's very much like the sun coming up in the morning. If you've been up looking at the stars and the beauty of the wonder of the universe, and then the sun comes up and you get kind of fried into this kind of local view, and it's very illusory. You know that there's far more out there, that it's far grander, but in essence our being kind of slave to the bright light of kind of the brain and our local here and now consciousness that is really a filtered down version of the much grander consciousness, we have this illusion that there's a reason there's a veil there. It's very much there for a purpose, and it has to do with what our souls are here for in the first place. But it's important to realize that this is very much kind of an illusory nature, even though the conscious aspect of us is the thing that truly exists. But it is intentionally not seeing the grander all that we know when we're able to bypass that limiting veil.
And I'd like to just compliment both of you, and also I just have to interject for a second two things. Number one, I too use the metaphor of the sun coming up versus seeing the stars, and that's in fact where I started on this journey over 20 years ago when I was a professor at Yale, was studying the nature of light. And one of the things that I was really struck by is that, during the night, if we're out in the country away from the city lights, there's no full moon, there's no clouds, we can see thousands of stars with the naked eye and trillions of stars with contemporary telescopes. But during the day, when the sun comes out, we don't see that light. And the question is, where did all that light go? And, of course, as you said, it didn't, quote, just disappear. It's not just not there. It's all there. It's just we can't see it because we're blinded by the brightest star in our vicinity, which we call the sun. Now, the take-home message that came to me, and this is what my second conclusion about, is science providing us with evidence for life after death. The conclusion that came to me was sometimes we need to go into the dark in order to see the light. I repeat, sometimes we need to go into the dark in order to see the light. So when I began doing research on mediumship, for example, and I began also then doing research on using technology, where we, for example, put a silicon photomultiplier detector, which detects single photons of light in a pitch black box within a box within a box environment. And then we invite specific spirits, discarnates, I call them post-physical beings, collaborators, to, quote, go into the box. We can then see increases in light, photons being detected by these sensors as well as other equipment. And when you do those kinds of experiments, and you add those experiments to the near-death experiences, which are absolutely profound, and then you add to those the mediumship experiments, of which we've now triple-blind experiments have been done, and now even a quintuple-blind experiment has been done. When you put all that evidence together, no one piece of it is, quote, proof. But if you look at the larger picture, which is what Eben's painting, you look at the larger picture, we have more evidence now, all pointing to this perception, this new, which is old vision of the primacy of consciousness. So I would state, from the larger scientific perspective, when we look at all the evidence, I think we're very close to, quote, proof, because there is no other hypothesis that can account for the totality of those kinds of data, except this hypothesis.
But Dr. Schwartz, it takes so much time for science, even in itself. Every knowledge that is being produced by science itself goes to the lay public, and it takes even longer to come back to itself, to restructure its curriculum, its mind, point of view, etc. So besides the need of keep on going with this research, what would you say we need to do to push the envelope and I wouldn't say expedite, but facilitate this open-mindedness regarding the need of a shift in the paradigm? Is there another way?
Well, I think first of all we need to amplify the things that we're already doing. So when you have people like Raymond and Eben, not just, quote, coming out of the closet, but coming out strongly, forcefully, and yet cautiously, responsibly, respectfully, but yet firmly staying with the evidence. The critical thing is sticking with the facts. Because if you just stay with the facts are sort of like overwhelming. And so you need ever more, I believe, individuals, but they also need to come together, and they need to come together across multiple organizations and ultimately build a community that is greater than any one community. So, for example, you have communities like yours that sponsors Kardec Radio, which is bringing this message now to 61 countries. And you have been living these observations for all this time. You are part of that force, a critical part of that force. But those forces need to be better facilitated, better joined, and ultimately the debate has to be, for lack of a better word, has to be honest. People have to be willing to face their fears of change. And, we have a history of humanity where we're afraid to look through the telescope in Copernicus' time. And it wasn't just the priests who were afraid to look, the scientists were afraid to look too. So when we focus on consciousness as primary, then what we do is we ultimately focus on our own fears, our own thought models, our own filters, and we develop a sense of humility. And I think the future, by the way, is in young people. College students, high school students, they're ready to hear this. And they're grasping at some hope. They're grasping for a sense that we're not alone, that we're part of something greater, and so on. And I think that this is happening.
Exactly. So, Dr. Schwartz, as you're talking about the different people, we have a question by a listener from Puerto Rico who is named Ivan Figueroa Agricioni, and he asked about how much of the research that is being done, if it's replicated in different cultures, you would have seen something different, especially regarding mediumship.
That's a very interesting question. I mean, for example, this is an opportunity that's afforded by Spiritism, is because you have people that come from a tradition of Kardec, for example, and that whole philosophy, the Spiritist perspective, and you have all these mediums who are trained and living in that domain. And then you have Western mediums who don't know anything, for all practical purposes, about Spiritism or spiritualism or any of these histories. They're people who have just come upon these experiences in their own personal lives through their family upbringing or through a brain injury or whatever the case may be, and then they develop their own individual theories. And it would be fantastic to actually compare and contrast what experiences are shared among mediums from different cultures, for example, and what are relatively unique to the cultures, and which of those are dictated by the filters of cultures, and which of them are really being able to see more of the greater truth. That kind of research could be done. We would just need the opportunity to bring mediums from different cultures together.
Would it hold true, Dr. Moody Jr., for the experiences on near-death? Is there a cultural component that would either facilitate that type of awareness and acknowledgement?
Do you mean whether there is a cultural difference in the near-death experience or
yes,
in the way people talk about it?
I mean, the way, the first part of it, the way you phrased it.
Oh, yes. Well, it's very popular in this debate to say, it varies by culture. That's the sort of standard thing to say in the debate. But in reality, I just can't agree with that. I have been on all the continents except Antarctica, and everywhere I go, India, China, Japan, North and South America, all over Europe, I've been down into Africa. I hear these same things from people, but also people always say that that however articulate or well-educated they may be, they say they just have no words to describe it. And they often say that because of that, they may introduce terms that they've learned from their specific religious tradition in an attempt to verbalize this, but it's usually with the proviso that really this is something that transcends language. So, I mean, everywhere I've been, I hear these things of people telling me that they leave their bodies and watch the resuscitation from above, and they talk about the life review and seeing relatives and friends who've died. So to me, my impression is that this is a universal experience that may be described a little bit in different cultural terms, but that's within the proviso that there aren't any adequate words anyway.
Raymond, I think that is a beautiful point, because to me, the thing that struck me is, I spent my first 6 weeks after my coma writing down my whole experience, but not reading anything about near-death experiences on the advice of my older son. But then when I did start reading NDEs, and then beyond that, afterlife literature and writings of prophets and mystics going back 3,000 years, the thing that struck me was all the similarities. Yeah. And it far transcends the kind of minuscule differences that certainly seem to entrap many of the skeptics in going through this. They're so caught up in some of the minutiae of some of the differences and details that they fail to realize the profound similarities that transcend cultures around the globe, across millennia, and that part to me is the most stunning. And it is clearly something that is so far beyond language. And yet when I talk with others who have had all manner of deep transcendental spiritually transformative experiences, not just NDEs, but you start to realize that the communication transcends the words in many ways. I mean, the words offer kind of an anchoring point, and yet so much of what is being said and conveyed is really beyond the meaning of the words, because the words come from an earth-based language.
Mm-hmm. By the way, if you had asked me that, reframed that question with regard to mediumship, I would have answered it the same way that Raymond and Eben has. The truth is, if you look at the commonalities far outweigh the differences. And in fact, I would guesstimate that 90% of the experiences of mediums are the same, whether they're from Iceland or America or South Brazil or Russia, the mediums that I'm familiar with, or Israel. Their experiences are universally extremely similar. There are differences that are, but to the grand universality, they're trivial in comparison.
So as you're saying this, I know Dr. Eben Alexander, he has an appointment, he has to go, and we're truly grateful for his presence here. Dr. Alexander, before you go, would you like to leave a final message, especially for the listeners who either have experienced that or have a loved one who has experienced a near-death experience? Would you like to say something to our audience?
Yeah, I would, and that is, I think it's important to understand that any truth that we ever arrive at through any system or thought or whatever evidence, we have to begin by entertaining that truth is possible. And what I would urge people to do, and I wrote my book mainly for skeptics, is what I would urge people to do is simply open your minds to possibility. And don't be sucked in by others' dogma, because it's very simple to get kind of sucked into the current dogma of the culture. But open one's mind, and I've found certainly that for me, meditation, centering prayer, deep meditation, is a wonderful pathway towards a deeper knowing, and not necessarily just listening to that monkey mind in my head. The little voice in your head is not your consciousness. And there's much deeper wisdom in there, but it takes taking that little voice and quieting it for a little while. And definitely important to realize, and this is something that was very strong from my journey and from so many other near-death experiences, we are deeply loved and cherished forever by an infinitely powerful creator. And that is something that can provide tremendous comfort once one opens that consciousness within each and every one of our own existence to be available to that and to see the possibilities of that. And I hope that people will see that and come to know that, and listen to that deeper knowing within each and every one of us, and realize that love is the coin of that realm, and that is so crucial to know how important that is, and it has infinite power. And I appreciate your having me on the show today, and I'm sorry I have to run for some July 4th festivities, but I appreciate being here, and best to you, Raymond, and to Gary, and really love the conversation.
Likewise, Evan. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander, especially for bringing the love element that we need so much, and it's so healing to the world. We hope to have you back to Kardec Radio. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Moody Jr., we know that you have put together with David Hinshaw the conversations with Dr. Eben Alexander more deeply on this. If people want to get a hold of this, they can go to your website, right, to access?
Yes, to raymondmoody.org. And another thing I'm very pleased about that I have done with David Hinshaw is that we have put together a 14-hour course on DVDs, and it's really putting together, I think, a very thorough exploration of the whole notion of life after death and how to investigate it. So, and the conversation with Eben is an aspect of that. So,
Dr.
I look
Schwartz?
forward to viewing that. I really look forward to viewing that. And as you know, I have an appointment also, so I'm going to have to leave momentarily. But I would like to, first of all, thank you for having this show on celebrating July 4th. I mean, so Independence Day, because what this ultimately should be is an Independence Day from the dogma of certain beliefs, which has kept us from seeing the greater reality. So may this be an Independence Day from that kind of dogma. Secondly, I want to thank you for allowing me to listen in and contribute a little bit to the conversation with Raymond. I mean, they're phenomenal people, and for me to be a fly on the wall and to be brought up to what they're currently doing is for me personally wonderful. Is obviously for your audience, and I look forward to. I'm gonna order your DVDs ASAP.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate
I've been waiting for a long time.
It's always good to talk to you.
Yeah, so that I'm doing ASAP today. The third thing I would just like to share is to honor this notion of hope and possibility and the power of not just intuition but also of reason and and ultimately the question of love. Now, Canyon Ranch's motto, by the way, which I have, is one of my affiliations, is the power of possibility. The whole notion of believing something is possible is critical. I was talking about the Wright brothers moment a while earlier about they believed that flight was possible, and it was that belief in the possibility and the people who witnessed it. But the question was, 110 years ago, not whether flight was possible anymore, but whether it would become something practical and eventually would we, quote, all take it for granted. And what I have proposed in my book, The Sacred Promise, is that we're living in another Wright brothers moment. Because those of us who have read my book or read some of my papers or read some other papers, key papers in areas in addition to near-death experiences like on the technology, the question is no longer, is this possible? The question is, can we envision what it will become, and how long is it going to take before we, quote, all take it for granted? 110 years ago, none of us could fly, and now we take for granted we can get on a plane and go anywhere, practically in the world. Well, and now we all take for granted that you're talking to me on my iPhone because the landline wasn't working properly, and so we now take our smartphones for granted. Well, how long is it going to take before we take our cell phones for granted? And the number one purpose of all of this is love. It is the basis of all of it. It's why people seek out mediums. It's why mediums typically do their work. It's the number one message that comes through with near-death experiences. And it's been my experience, and you hear it in Raymond's voice, you hear it in Eben's voice. There's so much love. There's so much caring. There's so much compassion. There's so much celebration. There's so much sense of blessing and humility and so on. It's very uplifting. And that same experience is what happens when I go to any of the Spiritism events. I come to your events, and I'm infused with all of that. So I just want to thank you and apologize for leaving, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schwartz. And we have to say this. You kick-started Kardec Radio with us 2 years ago. Today is our anniversary show. And you always bring to us this awareness that we need to free our minds from even scientific dogma sometimes. And this is an opportunity for us. And we have to say that you and Dr. Moody Jr. currently have been great pillars, foundational pillars for us at Kardec Radio. You both can count on Kardec Radio to disseminate your thoughts, your findings. Not only that, but as you said, Dr. Schwartz, since there is a spirit realm that we can count upon to expedite our progress, we would say that they also may count on us to spread the news, and we are very grateful that you both are here with us, not only today, but have been and been sharing, opening all of our minds to a new understanding about ourselves, life, and hopefully transform our social dynamics as well. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. Thank you, Dr. Moody Jr.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. So we're going to give a short break. When we come back, we are going to continue for the last hour of the program today.
And I have to leave now, too, unfortunately. But it's always so good to be with Kardec Radio, and I've been with you in Maryland, as you know. So I just always am so grateful to you for this, and it's also wonderful to be with my colleagues today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moody Jr. And we want to remind everyone, actually, that if you want, as Kirsten DeMello was asking us to recap the website, go there, raymondmoody.org, so you can get a hold of the video series, the course, on their conversation with Eben Alexander. And for Dr. Schwartz, those who are asking us, you can go to his website, drschwartz.com. If you have any questions, either you Google or you send an email to us at Kardec Radio. We have more for you. A big hug to you, Dr. Schwartz. Big hug to you, Dr. Moody Jr. We hope to have you back soon at Kardec Radio. Okay?
Yes, me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
And happy 4th of July.
Oh, you too. Happy 4th of
July.
Bye-bye.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Spiritist Network, your gateway to on-demand Spiritist videos. www.spiritistnetwork.com.
Spread the word. Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.
Want to find a good way to explain life after physical death to kids or teenagers? Check out the book Message from a Teen in the Spirit World by the Spirit Neo Lucio and Sakura by Chico Xavier. In this book, a teenager named Carlos explains his impressions on the new life in the spirit realm with his discarnate relatives and new friends. Purchase your copy online at www.ssbaltimore.org.
The Spiritist Magazine is a trimestral, digital periodical that publishes the latest news on the Spiritist thought and the movement in the USA and worldwide. Subscribe now at www.spiritistmagazine.com.
Listen to our sister radio, Bazera Online Web Radio, retransmitting Kardec radio shows 3 times a day. Also beautiful and inspiring programs in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Go to www.spiritist.com.
A Primer on Being Good by the Spirit May May, psychographed by the medium Chico Xavier, explains in simple language appropriate for children 2 paths in life, the path of good or the path of evil. God has granted us the freedom to choose either one. Purchase your copy online at www.ssbaltimore.org.
Now we return to our program.
Dear listener, we are here celebrating the 4th of July, as it is the 2nd anniversary also of Kardec Radio. Can you believe it? We are also celebrating independence. As Dr. Schwartz said, we should actually be celebrating the independence of our dogmatic views in life. And we bring that from many reincarnations. Now we are here, Kirsten DeMello, Daniel Santos, Carlos Diaz, John De Rosa, Steve Shepard, Bernadette Leal, and many other friends, Luis Sergio Marotta, at Kardec Radio team, discussing about this beautiful conversation about 3 great minds that were actually talking about even Spiritism and Kardec, right, Kirsten?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it was interesting listening to these big guys talk, respectfully. What came to our minds is when Dr. Schwartz was talking about this idea of envisioning something in order for it to really manifest. And what came to our minds is from the book Action and Reaction. When Assistant Silas, he makes this comment, and I'm going to quote directly, and he says that we are not even close to understanding the creative and agglutinative power contained in pure and simple thought. It's amazing. So that really came to our mind when Dr. Schwartz talked about being the necessity of envisioning something first in order for it to manifest, because it's a goal we work towards. So it's amazing. We really feel that perhaps is something we can utilize in our own spiritual life when we want to overcome something, and envision yourself overcoming it. It's very comforting as well.
It is, and as you're saying this, one of the highlights for me this far about this conversation with them was when you were mentioning Andrea Lewis, and when we were mentioning Andrea Lewis at the beginning of the program with Dr. Schwartz, and we said, actually he reports so much of what is going to come about in material science as we progress. He was asking us to send the book, and this comes, at least of the three of them we mentioned, one is already in English, so he said he's going to do his homework. What a humble heart, what a humble mind. But at the same time, it seems to us, Kirsten, that Andrea Lewis really brings the missing link that probably the scientists need to even expedite their own search. Don't you think so?
Absolutely, and we really feel that it is in those books that perhaps people like Dr. Gary Schwartz and others, the other speakers here today, will indeed find that missing link, and perhaps even more further inspiration to do their work. And we really liked the aspect that Dr. Schwartz brought, this neutrality, but it seems as though it reminded us of Kardec about these universal truths, that we do not need to be under the title of Spiritism to have this truth. And it just further confirmed once again what Kardec and the good spirits brought more than a century ago is still true today, that we find these universal truths everywhere, in science, outside of science, and across the globe.
And it's funny you're saying this, the universality, because when we heard Dr. Eben Alexander, the author of Proof of Heaven, he was briefly summarizing the much he learned after his near-death experience, and he basically summarized all the concepts from reincarnation, the angelic forces that act in our lives, etc., the afterlife, blah, blah, blah. So it's so universal that it doesn't depend on the label, and that's good news for all of us as well.
It absolutely is, especially with their background. We were discussing here earlier that it's amazing. We learn in the Spirits book that the Spirits tell us that God from time to time sends these great minds to really push progress forward, and it's evidenced by these Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Moody, Dr. Eben Alexander, to really push a part of progress forward, especially in science. I like this idea of the unveiling, or rather the spiritual facelift, or even a facelift of our understanding of how spirituality and science are bridged together in our understanding, or redefining of the definitions.
Of the definition, that's for sure. And Kirsten, we have here John Rosa from Kardec Radio's team. He also has a comment. Hi, John. Thank you so much for being with us and for collaborating throughout this, especially the last year at Kardec Radio. You said you have a comment regarding some conversations that Dr. Eben Alexander and Moody Jr. and Schwartz were having about. Would you like to relay to the public?
Yes, thank you, Vanessa, and everybody else. It's been, as you say, fascinating, and it's so much to absorb. But early on, when you were interviewing Dr. Schwartz, it just struck me as his research into this. What do you call it? The instrumental transcommunication, where he's using instrumentation to do the same thing that the mediums do. And what struck me was that we, from the spiritist side, are developing our communication ability that we all understand, that each one of us has to varying degrees. And he's trying to do it from the scientific side using technology. And we both are headed towards the same point. And eventually, I myself would love to develop the innate ability that I have, but still have the possibility of using some technology to do basic things, and that's what really stood out to me.
Yeah, it's very interesting because Andre Lewis, he talks about in the book In the Realms of Mediumship, and also Mechanism of Mediumship, about this way of communicating between two worlds through instruments. And probably what is fascinating about Dr. Schwartz, as you were also mentioning, is the fact that he's trying to find a way to become ever more neutral and less dependent on a fluctuating human mind. Because as he says, it depends on our consciousness as mediums, and only Chico Xavier this far, I'm not going to say he's the only one, but the only one that was researched and proved upon, that was really a clear filter. He didn't create any obstacle for this communication, but it's an exception. Majority actually do. And what is interesting, John, is this first statement that Gary Schwartz made when he said, after researching so many mediums, right, Kirsten, I was kind of very shocked from his perspective. He was telling us that many people are actually frauds.
Right.
And this is something that is a big discussion for us.
Well,
go ahead.
One thing that pops into my head, I have to believe, I don't really know, but I'm sure the spirits know, I have to believe that our communication ability, our mediumship capability had to have been phenomenal way back when, because just because of the communication with nature, the understanding of the Creator, and then it got diminished, and now it's coming back again in two different ways.
Hi, yeah, this is Kirsten. Yeah, that's interesting. You should say that. It really comes, we believe, as the good and noble spirits have really organized themselves in such a way that it came with the Fox sisters here in the U.S. and in France with the Kardec and the movement there. And, John, you mentioned this idea of way back when, quote unquote, and we remember someone recently discussing with us as well, mentioning about the American Indians and their spirituality. But we believe, that everything is programmed exactly as it should be, that the good spirits have a perspective, and even that Kardec talks about, I believe it's in the Genesis, it's like they are standing on a mountaintop and they are watching all of us. And they are perfectly programming when the time is right for us here in the U.S. and throughout the world, when the world is really ready to receive it. Kardec came at a time that the world was ready for it to commence the work, in the same way that in Brazil and also in India and different places, this idea of spirituality, of communicating with the beyond, was already being planted and installed little by little. And even the good and noble spirits told Kardec at his time that he wouldn't see the full, we would paraphrase, the full blossoming of the work. But now we are beginning to really see, we would say respectfully, how it's slowly blossoming. And oftentimes people don't realize about the immensity of the work that goes on across the board with brothers and sisters, we would say, with similar ideas as Spiritism. There are even groups of people throughout the world that are uniting together to bring about this divine consciousness, this idea of life after death. It's manifesting. It's almost as if it's inevitable. When Kardec in the Spirits book, in specifically Part 3, the Law of Progress, we see that although we could halt progress forward a little bit, but ultimately we have to move forward, and we see that now this is what's happening in the world. We have to begin to accept this idea. Not we have to, we are. We're seeing it manifested really amongst all civilizations, for sure.
Definitely.
Exactly. So, as we're talking about opening our minds, we need to share our knowledge. And at Kardec Radio, as we're celebrating 2 years of our anniversary, there is much yet to be accomplished. but it's interesting to share a little bit about the behind the scenes with our audience. And John, you and Steve Shepard have been bringing weekly segments of the Spirit's Book by Allan Kardec to us. Would you like to share a little bit of how the making of these segments have been happening?
Do we have Steve on the line with us too? No, just me.
I'm not sure Steve is here, but he is listening to us, but I don't see his phone line here. So if you would like to bring it up, and if he is listening to us, he can call us in.
Okay. Well, this whole concept of bringing the various portions of the Spirit's Book to the radio station, the Kardec Radio. I guess you and I had talked about it a while ago, and it's always been a desire to do some recordings, and of course, what better recording than to do the Spirit Book in English, which hasn't been done yet.
Actually, John, I'll open the line for Steve. Sorry to interrupt you because he's right here with us now. 1 second.
Good.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you for being with us today as well. And John was just kickstarting, telling about how the making of this beautiful segment of the Spirit's Book by Kardec have been happening. And if both of you, sorry to interrupt you, John, if you could keep on going, and Steve, please share with us how it's happening.
I was listening, wonderful show, and listening to the comments John was making, right on, spot on.
And you got together and we decided, okay, we're gonna add these segments in, and you said we said, well, somebody's gonna be the Kardec voice and somebody's gonna be the Spirit voice, and you suggested that Steve might take that particular role, and that started us down the road with doing the recordings, and we had to find a particular program that both of us could use to do that, and that became a learning experience. And I think Steve could probably comment a little bit more on that.
Oh, yes. When we first started, there are many different versions of the Spirit's Book that are available, and we selected the latest one, and I do believe there's a new translation being worked on as well for future publication.
Well, this is something we don't know yet. We know that the translation we have is fantastic.
It is.
The translation we have by EDC, the International Spiritist Council, is reliable. We actually don't understand why people need to translate another one, because there's so much work to be done, but we respect that. We would say for the version you're using, it's the best version we have this far, and I would say for a long time, it's going to be long-standing.
It is. I've read earlier versions and done a few segments here and there, and sometimes the words were a little difficult for me to process, but in this version, it's reading very well, and it's very enjoyable to read. I think it's a unique way to read the Spirit's Book. It gives you a different perspective and for me, a deeper understanding of the book, to not only read it, but read it aloud, and then read it with feeling and with an interpretation of how the Spirit might actually have been saying to Kardec when he was making this book. It's a very interesting way of getting into and understanding the book. Very enjoyable.
Hey John, hey Steve. This is Daniel Santos from Baltimore. I just have a quick question to you guys. First of all, congratulations. The segment is beautiful and well done. My curiosity is about how is the technical? Because I know Steve, you live in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, and John lives in Virginia. So it looks like when we see the final product, the edit is pretty good. So the quality of the audio looks like you guys are in the studio in Kardec Radio, Studio Kardec Radio. So how did you guys do the technical thing?
The technology is wonderful. We use a recording program on a PC. John records the questions, and then I am able to edit in the answers, and it just is so easy to make it sound like a live dialogue with the technology that's available today.
That's the beauty of technology, isn't it? We can be in Baltimore, Virginia, Pennsylvania,
Canada,
New York, Canada, England, and so it looks like we are, together in a place, but in fact we are in different places on the planet, and that's the beauty of technology. Hey, congratulations!
It allows us worldwide to collaborate with each other, and it's very wonderful.
Hey, this is Kirsten. I also wanted to make a comment, sort of piggybacking off here. Also, we have been doing a segment, and John and Stephen, maybe you can agree with us in what we're about to say, that as we've been doing this particular segment in Part 3 of the Spirit's book, The Divine Natural Laws, we realized that we came to a much more deeper understanding ourselves on those particular laws, and it was quite enlightening for us. We hope and we pray that it was also enlightening for those who are listening. But would you guys say that you came across the same realization, that through your current recordings, because you're reading it, having to take it in, are you also feeling like you're learning more?
That's no doubt. Simply from the fact that I have to listen to it 3 or 4 times. As Steve's saying, I have to read the questions. He has to record the answers. And just as a matter of course, you have to go over it at least 2 or 3 times, sometimes more than that. And then after Steve sends it back to me, I put the music to it. And so, again, I'm listening to it. So, yes, I would definitely say that my absorption is probably the proper term for me anyway. I'm absorbing so much more of the Spirit's book just simply because I go over it so many times. I wish, in a way, that I'm so focused on making sure that it sounds proper that I don't always listen and put it all together. But the more that it happens, the better it's getting. It might not go in exactly as the way I wanted it to go into my mind, but just the fact that I'm doing it so often helps me. I know it helps me, and I know I'm getting help from whatever Spirit's helping me.
Yes, I agree completely, and so much so, I think that any of the books that you take on to read, they take on a new dimension if you just actually take the time to read it out loud and speak what you're reading. It gives a new dimension, I think, to what you're reading and what you're understanding.
Yes, and as you were saying this, it brings us, would like to share with our listeners. By now we have collaborators throughout the world. We have Marco and Joyce Magalhães from Canada, who weekly send their collaboration, their segment, and which is entitled Spiritism in Your Lives. We have Kirsten DeMello, with the help of Daniel Santos, every week bringing to us Spiritist Moment. They are in Baltimore, Maryland. We have Steve and John, who are in different locations, and they put it together, which is beautiful. Steve is in PA, and John is in Virginia. We have Bernadette Leal, who is bringing this awareness to parents, kids, youth, the Yes segment, which is every 2 weeks, and she is located in California. We have Luis Sergio Marotta, who is in Brazil, Belo Horizonte, Brazil, bringing us the understanding about the Gospel according to Spiritism. And we have his brother, James Marotta, who often brings us Spiritist songs that he composes and some of the understanding of messages that actually brought this music to these songs to life. We also have Carla Carvalho, who is from South Florida, and she records the Happy Life excerpts. So we have arranged, and we have much more. There are many, many people who want to contribute. And if you are listening to us and you think of an idea of a segment or something you'd like to contribute with Kardec Radio, just submit your idea to Kardec Radio at kardecradio@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to consider your collaboration, because Kardec Radio, though it's completing 2 years, there's a lot more to be done, and we need a lot more people to expand it and to make it into not only one radio station, but a network of spiritist knowledge and bridging conversations with the world regarding spirituality in general. And as we are approaching the final quarter, the final 15 minutes of the program today, we would like to open for other considerations that we may have. One question that people ask me often is, what types of themes actually were more popular during the first 2 years of Kardec Radio? That's a very interesting question. Like, what themes? And fascinating as it is, there were mediumship actually was top one. Whenever we talk about mediumship, our audience escalates. When we talk about the fact that we talk about near-death experiences and the afterlife, it gets people's interest as well. And things that are general to the people's needs in everyday life. Because people are suffering, right, Kirsten? They are suffering, and we can tell by the numbers of the listeners who have been listening to Kardec Radio this far that when we bring things like we're going to bring this month, autism, people really have been requesting that we become down to earth, go to the core of their problems, and bring solutions, especially from a more spiritual, spiritist perspective.
You know, Vanessa, I just wanted to mention something that's not from myself, but we were visiting a different state here in the U.S., and a woman had approached us and had asked if we were one of the people who collaborated with Kardec Radio. We said yes, and she just simply said to us, very moving with tears in her eyes, and she said, well, I wanted to say thank you, because Kardec Radio came at a time where at the time she had lost her son. He had taken his life, and although she was spiritist, she was very distraught naturally, because we are human and we are not perfect spirits yet, and we love our children. She was very distraught, and she said that at that right moment, Kardec Radio came and consoled her heart and really was sort of like a good friend who got her through a difficult storm. And we were also very emotional when we heard her say this. So we know that it does reach people who really do indeed need assistance, spiritists and non-spiritists.
Exactly, and that's why many people also ask about the reasons why we bring non-spiritists to Kardec Radio, because the simple answer is, because we read Kardec's books, and Kardec was open-minded. As the editor-in-chief of the Spiritist magazine, I can tell by his works. For those who don't read Portuguese, it's very hard to tell. But Kardec, in his 12 volumes of the Spiritist magazine, as we now proceed with his work through the support and sponsorship of the International Spiritist Council, that Kardec was so open-minded that he often talked to people who were non-spiritists. So, for obvious reasons, there were non-spiritists at the time, one. And two, because he understood that these ideas are universal. As Kirsten was telling us earlier, the universality of these teachings are real. It is a real fact. So much so that Kardec, in the introduction of the Gospel to Spirit, according to Spiritism, he mentions about the universality of these teachings. So for that reason, we needed to open the discussion to missionary minds, as Emmanuel says, ministers of God, many of the scientists and people who are working in their communities, relieving their pain and sorrows by opening the awareness of people around the world. So in that regard, we would say when we bring the teachings through the Spirit's book, we are actually John DeRosa and Steve Shepard are giving an opportunity every week for people to dive more deeply into understanding of our own selves, who we are. And Kristen actually wants to, as we're talking about the universality of the teachings, she is going to read for us a passage right now from the book Opinião Espírita, Spiritist Opinion, by André Luiz through Chico Xavier.
And we feel inspired to bring this message. We talk about the universality of these truths, but also the personal responsibilities we have as those bearers of this knowledge. And bear with us as we read a translation that is not our own. It's entitled as The Spiritist Character, and as Vanessa said, it's from the book Opinião Espírita, or Spiritist Opinion. The worker of Spiritism cannot live differently from others. He will be influenced by his own conscience to live in accordance with his Spiritist convictions, which will give him a special awareness for each of his actions. And at the end, Emmanuel says something also. It's a long message. We're just shortening it here. And he says, the true Spiritist lives his life as others do, but he will always be called upon to serve others through his attitudes. So it's interesting. It's just bringing a different perspective when Dr. Eben Alexander talked about the heart, the emotion, and living our day-to-day lives, truly believing it in all of what we talk about and being the living example. It just came to our mind that Kardec also lived this way as well. He lived what he believed in as well. And it's just something we felt perhaps we wanted to remind ourselves and perhaps others who are listening as well. It's a beautiful message from Emmanuel.
Yes, and as you're saying this, the inspiration for us at Kardec Radio is always the message by André Luiz, which is now being published. We hope it's going to be released either today or tomorrow, the latest issue of the Spiritist magazine, which actually is like probably of all the 22 issues this far, is probably one of the groundbreaking, because it brings an unprecedented letter by Chico Xavier. Probably nobody has ever seen, because it was recently presented to us by a friend named Geraldo Lemos Neto, and we actually got a hold of the original copy in our own hands. We're publishing that, but in that issue of the magazine, you will see André Luiz' inspiration to our conduct before the radio. There he talks about one of the most important things. Sometimes people think that, Vanessa Saloni is creating things, and I'm not creating anything. Actually, the spirits do guide they mentor also Kardec Radio in itself. We follow through their instructions, but mostly the instruction and guidelines we follow through is André Luiz on Spiritist conduct at the radio, when he says that this is an opportunity for us to disseminate the teachings. But clearly, he says we need to be so open-minded, because there are people coming from all different religions to listen to the programs. And if we are not in the mindset of St. Paul or Paul the Apostle, or however we want to call Paul, he was the one that inspires us the most regarding how to put together and align these programs, because we need to speak in the language that people understand, and we're not here solely to speak to Spiritism. We're here to talk to the world and actually to share the teachings in a way that we can bridge it up, what people know, what we are sharing, and how we can both expand our awareness to a greater thing. So in that regard, we are here also acknowledging Brian Vosberg's sharing his thoughts when he talks about topics he would like to see at Kardec Radio regarding inner transformation. Thank you, Brian, for sharing that insight. It's very important to have feedback. Also, he talks about his interest on post-traumatic stress disorder. Interesting enough, we actually brought one of the experts in the field, right, who was here at Kardec Radio, and you can recap the program. Some people ask us, how do I listen to Kardec Radio? You can listen live every Saturday through your computer, through your tablet, through your smartphone, and you can listen on demand through your computer. You just go to kardecradio.com, and there we have it. First page, you don't need to browse anything else. If you go to the first page, the home page of Kardec Radio, on the right-hand side, at the right bottom part of it, there is an icon there about Blog Talk Radio. If you just scroll down, you're going to find your show since day one, 2 years ago. You don't need to go anywhere else. It's very simple. But if you want, you can go straight to Blog Talk Radio's website. Just type in Kardec Radio. All of the shows are there. Or you just open iTunes from your computer, from your tablet, from your cell phone, and you can listen to Kardec Radio shows on demand at your own pace. You may be asking what is holding on as perspectives for Kardec Radio regarding its 30 year of life. What's happening? The third year, many things. We are adding more people to the team of collaborators, and you can be one. If you have an idea, just write to us. Don't be shy, because we need more helpers. You know, we are an international team working to share the much that has been given to us. But we're going to open a segment on another day of the week, because many people want to do the God at Home meeting, or they call the Gospel at Home meeting, and they don't know how. So it's going to be a short day, and we're still planning on the day of the week it's going to happen, and hopefully some people will take turns with us to feed it up. But it's to do the God at Home meeting with you, listener, wherever you are. We're going to use some books that are properly addressed in that regard. We are also going to start streaming Spiritist Talks, because Daniel Santos has been coordinating the Spiritist Network, and he has a long list of great Spiritist Talks from speakers around the world that can be very illuminating for people. So it's going to be another day when we're going to be streaming this. And we have much, much more. For now, these are the main ideas that are being held true. And I know you want more, but if you want more, we need to hear from you. And especially if you want to collaborate. There are so many ways of collaborating. As we are in these final 2 minutes, would like to open up the lines for Kirsten de Mello, Daniel Santos, Carlos Diaz, to help us finish up this great 3-hour program of Kardec Radio today.
Hi, this is Kirsten. I would say our last comment would be from the preface of the Gospel According to Spiritism. Quote something small. It says, and it's from the Spirit of Truth. Verily, I tell you that the time has come in which all things must be reestablished according to their true meaning, in order to dissipate the darkness, to confound the proud, and to glorify the righteous. It's just a small part of it, but we feel that at Kardec Radio we are dissipating the darkness and turning on the light.
True. Thank you, Kirsten.
And my final comment is just, let's keep working and open our mind to receive more good inspiration from our mentors as we do the best that we can, and keep this open mind. I think Kardec Radio has a great space where we can breed together science, spirituality, and religion without fighting, but just collaborating. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Daniel, for helping as well. And Carlos Diaz is saying his goodbye, because he is the producer of the show here, and he's telling us that we have only 1 minute. So we're going to use this minute to thank you, Bernadette Leal, for being here with us at the Kardec Radio, bringing so much goodness. Luis Sergio Maroda, James Maroda, Marco Magalhães, Joyce Magalhães, Carla Carvalho, and everyone at Kardec Radio, but mostly you, dear listener, because without you, we couldn't be here, but without God and the good spirits, we couldn't do any of this. So our greatest gratitude is now our short prayer to the good spirits. Thank you, dear loving mentors of Kardec Radio, loving benefactors of the progress of humanity, and our dear Mother, Father God. Thank you so much for allowing us to redeem ourselves, being useful, sharing the much you have given us, the life you sustain in each of us. May you bless everyone who listens to this program. May you nourish their souls always. And most of all, we ask you, please, enlighten all the hearts and minds of the world, especially those who are suffering. And so be it. Next week, we have actually this Saturday, we have a program on autism and self-obsession. And then on the following one, The Unprecedented Letter by Chico Xavier. Many blessings, dear listener. Until then.
Thank you for listening to Kardec Radio, broadcasting live every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Email us and share your comments at www.kardecradio.com. Until next time, we wish you many blessings.